Shubat, and I have the privilege of holding the position of Director of Partnerships and Public Affairs with Ophea, and I will be one of your many hosts for today. So I'm so pleased to welcome you here this morning. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Chris Markham, Ophea's Executive Director and CEO, to kick us off. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Listen, it brings me a huge amount of pleasure and joy to welcome you here today and for us to reconnect, to refocus and reimagine health and physical education and the work that we collectively do on behalf of the organization. So Ophea's work is really impactful because of the amazing volunteers and contributors that we work with. I'd like to take a moment to recognize some of the groups that are here today. So when I name the group you're affiliated to, what we're going to try to do is to please have you share your camera, quickly raise your hand function so we can see who you are. Let's see how that works. So let me start off by acknowledging that we have our Ophea staff with us today. Hello, everyone. So pleased to have you here. We also have our board of directors joining us. We have Ophea ambassadors on the call today as well. So thank you. We also have our educators in action who are joining us today. Thank you. We have our Safety and Injury Prevention Advisory Committee. We have members of our Curriculum Advisory Council. Thank you. And then we have our colleagues from OASFE, and I'll do this together. We have our colleagues from OASFE, if they could identify themselves, such an important partner with Ophea and a joint subject association for health and physical education. And we also have some colleagues from the Government of Ontario who are joining us today. Thank you to all. I'll turn it back over to Tammy with a final just note, and it really is that I am just humbled by the work that all of our volunteers, our contributors, our staff do on a daily basis. You are an amazing group of individuals who contribute really meaningfully to the work of Ophea and to bettering school communities across Ontario. So I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today, to learn with us, and to engage in our exciting direction that is the work ahead of us. So with that, I will hand it back over to Tammy. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris. Et puis pour mes collègues francophones, si vous voulez nous donner la main aussi, on vous accueille avec grande joie aujourd'hui. Et puis je sais que vous siégez au sein de nombreux comités d'Ophea, donc ça nous ferait vraiment plaisir de vous accueillir. En grande partie, on va participer en anglais aujourd'hui, mais s'il y a des moments où vous voulez participer en français dans vos petits groupes, ça nous fait plaisir. Et puis, merci encore de vous rejoindre à nous aujourd'hui. Part of our journey over the last number of months has been influenced by some of the most brilliant and amazing consultants and facilitators, and we have the privilege of having some of them here with us today. So I'd like to welcome Robin Corey. Robin has been working to support Ophea in refining its strategy since about 2015 or so. Robin's a passionate coach, facilitator, and strategist, and also one of my favorite people. So Robin, I'm really thrilled to have you here with us today. And without further delay, I'll actually ask you to get us started.
Thank you, Tammy. Honestly, right back at you. It is just such a privilege to be here today and to have been alongside Ophea over the last number of years on your journey. And I really do feel like today's conversation is really the culmination of so much work and so many conversations. And I really want to start today in this moment with a land acknowledgement. So that's my honor for this beginning part, and then I'll be back sort of throughout the day tag teaming with Tammy. So we're going to actually start with a land acknowledgement from Stephen Paquette, who's a member of the Indigenous Education Council and Board of Directors of Sheridan College. And after this acknowledgement, would love you to reflect on your own practice with land acknowledgement. So as you listen, think about what stands out for you. And feel free to go ahead and play the video.
What I've learned from my elders is that when we do acknowledgement of the land, it's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to, because that Indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We were simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth. It's our relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with the trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with the plant life that is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients, it gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred, water is life. And what we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the woman. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to the next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father-son, or in some nations, brother-son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know all throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that Indigenous people were, for the most part, nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations have walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
I must say I've watched that video many times, and I seem to always leave with something a little bit different. But I think the common thing I leave with is this deep sense of gratitude, coupled with, I think, the gravity of responsibility. And what really struck me is what he said about the Indigenous worldview of being caretakers of the land for future generations, about fundamentally being about relationships with the land, relationships with all those that live on it. And I also wanted to bring in a couple of themes from the article we sent out in advance. Thank you, Janice. You're all going to meet Janice later if you haven't already. I know many of you know her well. The article talks about how too often non-Indigenous groups pursue gestures of apologies, renaming landmarks, education efforts, sometimes more kind of performative land acknowledgements rather than transformative change. And they suggest in the article that fundamentally the question is about how do we consider and rectify wrongs from colonization, allowing Indigenous people to thrive and build better communities for all. So really part of today will be spending time learning and deeply thinking about the cultural roots of physical education so that we're more able to see new possibilities for doing things differently and better around us for both Indigenous people and everyone. And with that, actually, it would be helpful. You can stick that slide back up, Tammy, because many of you, or all of you, I should say, should have gotten this handy journal mailed out to you in advance. I love it. It's an erasable journal with a cloth and a pen to write with, which is awesome. We're going to use it through the day. So we'd love you to have it on hand, write in a notepad that you have, write in that journal, whatever works for you. But would love to start that practice with having you take a minute or two, or we'll give you a few, to think about these two questions. How do you currently engage with land acknowledgements? Or how might you begin to show up differently in your own practice around land acknowledgements? And what actions might we take in our school communities to show up differently? So whatever threads of that you want to grab onto and reflect on would be great. And we'll just give you a few minutes to do that. I see lots of your heads still in your journals, so I don't want to interrupt your stream of thought, but we're not going to reflect as a group on this one quite yet, but we're going to have some time later in the day to kind of return to this reflection and this line of conversation after we hear a little bit more from Janice. But you're going to have a break and lunch and other moments in the day. So if we ever run out of time for the personal reflection exercise, feel free to go back to your notes. We're also going to do a mix of reflecting individually and also spending time in pairs and small groups through the day. So there'll be lots of kind of moments of pause throughout. So with that, I'm going to take you through the agenda to give you a sense of how we're going to spend our time together. So you can go ahead and flip to the next slide. Perfect. So in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to the fabulous Tammy, who happens to also be one of my favorite people, to offer some highlights from Ophea's strategy, this journey the organization has been on. And we'll do a little exercise together. Following that, I'm going to introduce you to my colleague, Chanel Grenouille, and she's going to spend some time, as the agenda says, talking about power and privilege in the context of health and physical education. We have a guest here, Yumi Lee, who's going to be doing some Q&A with Tammy and me to talk more about her own experience. We're going to pause for lunch and come back for some awards. And then, as mentioned, we're going to hear from Janice after lunch, Janice Forsyth, to talk about how physical education has been used as a tool for Indigenous assimilation, and talk about some calls to action and reflective thoughts and practice for this group. And then we're going to come back together and do a little bit of imagining at the end of the day as we look towards the future. So that's our game plan. And just to really highlight sort of the objectives within that. So if we flip to the next slide, I won't read these out, but overall, we want you to walk away from today more clear about, and we hope excited to be a part of this new direction for Ophea. We've also built into the day, as I've said, lots of opportunities for individual and group reflection. So you'll have a chance to consider, and in some cases, we think wrestle with concepts and ideas, and ultimately hope you're going to be able to take things away to apply to your own practice and settings. And we know throughout the day and the conversations we have, you're going to be able to bring lots of rich experience and expertise from your own lives and your own work. And we welcome that. We welcome the chance to kind of hear and learn from each other through the day. We know that's a huge part of the richness of bringing this group together. So with that, I turn it back over to Tammy.
Thanks so much, Robin. So as Robin was referring to, we undertook a process in the spring of this year to really deeply and meaningfully look at the desired impact we wanted Ophea's work to have. We did a whole host of different exercises. We looked at data sources. We took inspiration from different thought leaders in education, like folks like Shane Safier and Jamila Duggan, who I know many of you have read Street Data. We took some inspiration from Gloria Ladson-Billings, from Nicole West Burns in the space of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And we also took some inspiration from folks in the world of business. And I know we shared with you a pre-listening exercise from Frances Fry and Young Mi Moon, looking at inclusion. And we also took inspiration from folks like Chip Heath, trying to understand how to communicate our impact. And so in going through all of this work, we were able to really refine and institute like some foundational framework shifts for us to really begin to understand how we wanted to make change in the world. And so this is where the strategy around conceptually the concept of every student can thrive really emerged for us. In terms of really trying to understand why equity-centered and why now, and what that sense of urgency may be around shifting our strategy. If you had the chance to read the advocacy position in the pre-read, you'll know that we still really fundamentally believe that quality health and phys ed is good for students. It can boast a whole host of social, emotional, and physiological benefits that could set the tone for a lifetime of health and well-being. We also still fundamentally believe that every single student has a right to quality health and physical education where they feel they belong. I think the concept of quality is really what we called into question in that advocacy position that we recently released, because the trouble is that not every student has the opportunity to experience this. In fact, some of our very practices in our subject area in particular is really deeply implicated in upholding and maintaining a whole host of oppressive and harmful behaviors. And the COVID-19 pandemic, just sort of contextually painting that picture, really not only did it exacerbate some of the inequities that some of these students were experiencing, but it really shone the light on the sense of urgency with which we should address them. So that's really where we began to define our own understanding of equity. So for us, equity has us acknowledging the harms and inequities that we've contributed to shaping, and actively working to learn, disrupt, and reimagine ways of working in collaboration with folks who have lived experience at the margins. Really moving in this direction is not a quick fix, but it's something that we fundamentally believe is well worth pursuing, because we know that an education system that works for students experiencing marginalization tends to work better for every single student. In terms of what that means for us in terms of our practice and stuff that we might be doing that may look a little different, and you've probably noticed this already this school year. You've seen us collaborating with equity-centered or equity-seeking groups and organizations and suppliers. You've seen us employ some equity-centered frameworks. So you've seen some conversations that we've led, leading with frameworks such as intersectionality, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And you've also seen that really some of our tools have shifted towards equipping educators with culturally relevant and responsive classroom supports and also learning opportunities. Really, what you've seen as well from us is just a real move towards amplifying and learning from voices at the margins. I think as an organization, like, we really went through an exercise around redefining some of our values, and we really tried to bring them down to sort of like that rule of thumb of perhaps no more than 3. So I think you'll see that the spirit of our equity values, shining through here, this concept of authentic and inclusive spaces. We really value curiosity, bravery, and humility, and these 3 are very specifically paired together. Bravery and humility, especially given the privilege with which this organization has been able to operate for the last 100 years. And we also really value each other's well-being. We always have. That's sort of a fundamental value of the organization that we continue to carry with us. I think what I'd like to share with you now really moves us in the direction of our belief statements and how that bleeds into the work that we're doing. And so there are 3 belief statements, but if I could really zero in on one that I would want you to really walk away with, is the concept of belonging as essential to well-being, and well-being as essential to learning. So really what we're saying here through this belief statement is that without belonging, all of the other health and learning and social and emotional benefits that we would hope for students to achieve through our work, it's not possible without first establishing a sense of belonging. What we went through was an exercise, and Robin and Chanel really helped us with this in terms of defining imperatives that would guide our work. If I were to tell you a bit more about what imperatives are, fundamentally they are sort of like these conceptual drivers of our work, and all of our work sort of feeds into these imperatives. So we have 4, and we believe that they are really interconnected, which is why you're seeing them sort of illustrated in this circular fashion. The first is sort of know your audience. The second one is this idea of centering the margins. The third one is this idea of illuminating the bright spots. And then the last one is inclusion first and diversity will follow, or practice inclusion first. When we say know our audience, for Ophea, what that really means is that we want to know more about who it is we're working with and who it is that we're not reaching. We want to really understand the needs of students experiencing marginalization. And we want to know where folks are at on their equity learning journey and how we can, begin to move them along that continuum. When we talk about centering the margins, and you've probably seen this quite a bit from our work most recently, is really just centering the voice of students and educators that have experienced marginalization. And the objective here really is to listen, to learn, and to shift the dominant narrative. With Illuminate the Bright Spots, really what we were striving for here is this idea of leveraging the power and privilege of Ophea's platform to shine a light on meaningful and equity-centered work going on across the sector. We do this to disrupt the dominant narrative, to raise awareness, and to share knowledge. Inclusion first and diversity will follow. If you had a listen to the podcast that we provided in advance, you'll know that we sort of borrowed this idea from Frances Fry and Yumi Moon. And this idea is really around building a deep culture of inclusion first for each and every one of us. And so that's all of you on the screen. It's for us as a staff team. It's for our board. It's for our key stakeholders and for everyone that we interface with. But fundamentally, we believe that if we are able to build that culture, the concept of, diversity targets or achieving, certain levels of diversity will come. So we're building this culture for ourselves, for those of us who are here now, and for those of us who will be joining us who are not here with us just yet. We really shifted the focus areas of the organization. I'm going to take a minute for you to read this on the slide, and I acknowledging fully there's a lot of text here for you to read. But what I think you will recognize, and many of you, contribute to projects and committees who contribute to the pieces of work that are on this list. But you'll notice that everything that we do is really positioned slightly differently. So there are key things that we're trying to learn and understand in our key areas of business. And so you'll see that sort of intentional shift in our focus areas. So I'll let you have a read. And what's perhaps important to walk away with here is that every focus area connects back into multiple imperatives, not just one. And every single granular project at Ophea connects into one of the focus areas. So something that I think will look similar to what you've seen before, or what you know about Ophea as an organization, is our theory of change. And so I know you've probably heard us talk before a little bit about what is our secret sauce around how we like to do our work in the education sector. And fundamentally, it has to do with the impact that we seek at the classroom, at the school, and at the school board, regional and provincial level. Fundamentally, that hasn't changed. We still believe and understand that working in these spaces will give us the desired impact that we seek. What you will see as a big shift within the organization is in the outcome space. And so those are the boxes and color blocks. And so where you would have perhaps historically seen outcomes around building capacity of educators, you'll see that those shift really with intentionality around building cultures of inclusion in classroom. There are big shifts around wanting all students, or every single student, to experience that sense of belonging. There are shifts around valuing the unique experiences of every single learner, and wanting to build that across the ways in which we work across the system. So if we move to that whole system level, really we're seeing ourselves facilitating some of that discussion around human rights and where that intersects with well-being at that whole school level, and how we might support school board leaders in promoting equitable and inclusive opportunities through our lens of health and physical education to fundamentally promote belonging. So that's really where you see the shift. And at the end of the day, sort of like that big key to success for us is when every single one of us, including ourselves and students, feel they belong. That is when we will know that we have been successful with our work. So I think I'm handing it back over to you, Robin.
You are. Thank you for that, Tammy. And we suspect that sparks some questions for you. Some of it may get clarified through the day, but where it doesn't, there is really I'll speak on behalf of Ophea, an open line of communication to be able to go back and share thoughts, share ideas, use the chat, email. But I know the Ophea team, we all kind of welcome your sort of reflections or questions of clarification on what's been shared. So we want to move into an exercise and get you all talking to each other a little bit. So in a minute, we're really gonna build on the theme that you're gonna see will be kind of a through line in today's conversations around belonging. And so we're going to put you in pairs, and they'll just be random pairs. And when you arrive in your room, we'd like you to start by introducing yourself and then offering reflections on the two things that are on the screen. So I'd love you to start by sharing your personal why for supporting Ophea's work and engaging in the space of health and physical education in schools. And then we'd really appreciate you sharing with your partner a personal experience in health and physical education. When you sort of think back to being a student, to what degree did you feel a sense of belonging? And if you could bring that to life through a memory or an experience that stood out for you, we'd appreciate that. And we will, in this case, have some time when we come back to do a few minutes of reflection together. In a second, I'll demo the first question, which might feel a little more abstract to some with Tammy, but I just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable in the Jamboard, being able to go in and share ideas. So as you're reflecting with each other, if there are specific things that you want to put up there, if you'd be willing to put up your why for supporting Ophea's work and engaging in this space, we'd really welcome that. But Tammy,
Mhm.
Give us an example. So what is your personal why for supporting
Mhm.
Ophea's work?
For sure. Thanks, Robin. I think for those folks who know me would know, like, I'm sure that why has perhaps shifted for me over the years. But I think, most recently as a mom of a 4-year-old, a young mixed race daughter who is a part of a 2S LGBTQ family, I think my concerns as she sort of enters the education system are really around having her lived experience be valued in her classroom, having our family be validated, and having her sort of lived experience be okay for her. And so I think that's a big motivator for me in the work that we're doing right now and in our equity-centered strategy. And it's deeply personal, but it's also, for every single student to have that experience as well.
Great. Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate that. So whatever your why is, take a minute and share that. And then if you could talk about your own personal experience as a second question. Jamboard, no Jamboard, all is good. We're going to press go and you'll have about 10 minutes to talk to your partners and then come back. All right. I think we've got everybody back. Thank you. So we've just got about 5 minutes, but would really appreciate the chance to hear a little bit of what came out in your conversation. So does anyone want to share either something, anything from the conversation, or specifically, does anyone want to reflect on their own personal experience as a student? You can use the hand button or just jump in.
The one that I want to point out is my experience as an HP student. And I was just about to start writing it on the sticky note. But so my lived experience as an HP student was the definition of privilege. So I was a white European. So, I mean, there was back then in the 70s and 80s, there was, I wasn't white Anglo-Saxon, but I was white. So, I just had no issues that way. I was an excellent athlete who was on all the school teams. And so I belonged. Phys ed was tailored for me. There was no sense of not belonging, and the concept of belonging or not belonging was just not something I even considered at any moment. So maybe there were moments of where I may have been isolated or not belonging, but I was oblivious to it because I was in my wheelhouse of confidence and competence and comfort all the time. So, so as a teacher, I look back and when I think about that, it's helped me as a teacher to empathize with those other students.
Oh my God, I love those 3 C's. I was in my wheelhouse of confidence, competence, and what was your third?
Confidence, competence, and
you had a third one. I was like writing down the first 2. But I really comfort. That was your third. Confidence, competence, and comfort. Wow. Okay, that's really powerful. Thank you, Joe. And thank you for sharing kind of the honesty that comes with that, right? Just that was, and like you said, this was well designed for me. Okay, who else wants to share?
I'll share.
Go ahead, please. Oh, Denise.
I had a nice conversation with Daniela, and we talked about the French English language component. And I said to her that I've always felt, and I tell Tammy this sometimes, that I don't always belong. But when it came to health and phys ed, because I excelled, I did feel like I had some capital or some bank that made me sort of fit in one way or the other, whether I was the only Black kid or however I identified and didn't have that sense. I could always rely on my movement and how I could participate in athletics. And then I also use that to kind of show other people that even though I'm good at athletics, I'm not just that jock, because other people could get away with being just a jock, for lack of better words. And I felt like I always had to prove myself in different ways. So as a student, I didn't understand the language and the lingo about privilege and power and oppression. And then as I got older and continued to educate and see students who weren't really invigorated or motivated to participate in health and phys ed, my goal was always to encourage them to just find something that they liked first, and then after that, figure out how to bring in the other things that they don't really like.
Mhm.
So it was nice to talk to Danielle about it, because she's going into education, and you know,
Mm.
the passion that she was showing, I feel like I had lost some of that. And so
Mm.
you really make me want to just change things. So I appreciate that. So thank you for my part.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for that. Lots of, I think, really important things to come back. I'm seeing hands though. Your comments sparked others. So rather than commenting back, even though I'd love to, let me go to, do you say it Royan?
I inspired very much of listening to the first two responses, and also talking to my partner in we could have talked for ages, but I think I want to share my personal why. I think comes very much from having a very kind of, I guess, a fortunate experience of being able to juxtapose my own feelings of having grown up not feeling like I belonged in either the physical or health education environments, and kind of being a stereotypical. I was describing it as like that kid in an '80s Hollywood movie, who when you're watching the movie it's very funny, but when you're experiencing it, it's not very funny. And then juxtaposing that against some, I think I never thought of this consciously, but like awareness that with my own children, becoming a parent, being quite committed and considering it a great priority for my own kids to find belonging in those realms. And so seeing that a lot of it did have to do with the differences in privilege and intersectional privilege that they were afforded, that I might not have been afforded in some ways due to economic privilege. But so having experienced like both sides of that coin, that's where a lot of my why comes from. And at the end of the day, just knowing that like belonging in health and physical education is actually some of the most fun you can have in life. And so to miss out on all that fun, and to miss out on all that community, and to miss out on all that growth and development as a healthy active person, is what's a real shame if we don't open up more doors so that more people can have access to that privilege.
So well said. Thank you so much, Royan. And I love, you're getting some comments in the chat too. And I love this idea of this can be the most fun thing. The sense of belonging brings with it great fulfillment and fun, and who's not getting to take advantage of that. And Denise, it looks like there's sort of a comment in response to your comment about, finding out what students like, and then finding ways to connect them to things or introduce them to things that join up. And I was really struck by your comment, Denise, about like excelling physically was your access to belonging in a lot of ways, but that's not going to be true for everybody. And so for those who can't excel physically or don't necessarily shine physically, how do you create that fun? How do you create those experiences? So we could go on much longer, and I love seeing the Jamboard filling up. Thank you for getting past our original technical difficulties, but you've more than made up for it here. So we actually have a few pages in a row of page to put ideas. So if that first Jamboard is filling up and you want to keep adding ideas here around your own experiences, please do now throughout the day as they come up. We will definitely reflect back on these and are grateful for them. But the second, third, and fourth Jamboards are all to kind of for Post-its for this question. I'm gonna pause there and turn it over to Tammy, who's going to pick up on this thread. Thank you all for both sharing in your small groups and being willing to share those larger group comments as well.
Thank you. Yeah, those were so wonderful and meaningful. We're going to just have one last brief sort of little exercise, sort of remaining on this thread of belonging. And it's connected to, for those of you who perhaps had the opportunity to do the pre-listen to the podcast, and if you haven't, perhaps you'll go back after the fact. But this concept that Francis Fry introduced around the continuum of inclusion. And so we're just going to do a little temperature check right now for ourselves, just around where we may sit on that continuum. So let me share my screen quickly and give you the opportunity to to access a poll. So if you utilize your device, there's a QR code here that you can scan. And I also know my colleagues are going to put a link to this poll in the chat. And so really we're asking you to answer the question from the perspective of, as a professional in the space of health and well-being in schools, how might you rate your own sense of belonging or inclusion? So we sort of have quite a few folks sitting on perhaps in that middle space of feeling welcomed, and then nudging into, there's a few more that are populating the celebrated, which is really interesting. So that's perhaps a little higher on the scale, which is great and perhaps not a surprise, right? If we look in the room, we're in a room of relatively like-minded individuals. We know each other relatively well, and perhaps we've found ways to carve out senses of belonging within our professional settings, and that's also a privilege, and perhaps that segues nicely into the next section that we'll be talking about around power and privilege. The other piece of that, though, if I were to refer back to some of our imperatives and thinking through the inclusion first and diversity will follow, we're always looking, although this is a snapshot of a moment in time, we'd always be looking to nudge that sense of inclusion to eventually moving us to a space of feeling cherished or experiencing that deeper sense of belonging. And so that, that is part of the work that we have charted out for ourselves as an organization. And I know we're all a part of that, building that community of deep belonging.
So let me introduce you to a friend and colleague, Chanel Grenouet. You see her bio on the screen, so I won't read it to you. Let me just share some highlights. Chanel has many years of experience with organizations and their leaders across the nonprofit sector on how, as she says, they can normalize and center conversations about racism and integrate equity-based approaches in their work. Chanel is a wonderful human. You're in for a treat. Without further ado, over to you, Chanel.
Thanks so much, Robin, and good morning. Welcome to everyone. It's a real privilege for me to be here. I've been working with Ophea and supporting them on this equity-centered journey for a few years now, and I'm just, again, honored to be sharing my learnings and my insights and building on the threads that have already been started. So by show of hands, who's really excited about the shift that is taking place at Ophea and the directions that have been laid out this morning so far? Lovely, lovely, lovely. Lots of hands, and love to see the excitement around this work. This is, this is my area of work, so I will admit my full bias in terms of really finding leadership, finding staff teams, working in spaces that are taking a serious and intentional look at what equity-centered practice looks like. And I think, again, as you delve into the strategic directives, I think you'll again get even more excited about the work that has started and the work that's going to happen. And so with over this next little 25 to 30 minutes with me, what I would like to do is to invite you to think about additional ways that you can engage in the journey that Ophea is going on. I'd like to start with the end in mind. So I'm going to tell you the three messages or the three things that I want you to think about now versus waiting till the very end of this session. So and the way I've broken it down is 3 A's. So we heard from Joe, and I totally loved your 3 C's. This is actually going to be trying to move away from those 3 C's and move into something new. And so it's the 3 A's. So the first one is awaken. If we can all see that word there on my post-it note. So basically, in terms of disrupting systems, disrupting this invisible culture that we're all living in, that again, right now has lots of barriers related to equity and inclusion. The first step I always say is, how can we awaken our awareness to this culture? How can we awaken to our own power and privilege as we move throughout society? and notice. How can we take that pause and notice? So those are other two things that we've been doing and modeling in this session, but that I think are really good first steps in terms of disrupting and interrupting systemic discrimination and bias. The second A is assess. So once you do that awakening and that noticing piece, you also need to do some sense making, some meaning making. So, assess again, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for my family, my community, my workplace? And then, the next question would be, what can I do about it? And really that's around the acting piece. What can I do to change the experiences of others, the experiences, of equity deserving groups, equity deserving students and colleagues and peers, so that they can, again, enjoy that feeling of belonging and inclusion at schools, in the classroom, and in other spaces of education. I'm going to give you one final A that hopefully you can just kind of keep in mind. And this is really, I think, what we're trying to do, again, as we engage in anti-racism, anti-oppression work. It's really about, stopping this autopilot. And if you can think about, throughout your day and in your day-to-day activities, again, take that moment of pause. What do you do on autopilot? And we do lots of things on autopilot. And which ones are really the ones that are, again, contributing to, again, cultures and practices that are not inclusive, that, again, don't create that sense of belonging. So that's the end, and I could stop now, but I won't. We're gonna delve into the idea of power and privilege. And in your reading package and the pre-reading materials, we shared this document. If you can have it handy, I'm not sure if any of you printed it up, but we will put it on the screen in a minute. Maybe we can put it up now, because I'll be speaking to it. So this image, and I always start off by prefacing that there's no one perfect image or model, but this one, developed by Dr. Amy Tan, for me, can really spark some good conversation and some good, again, reflection points related to power and privilege in Canada. So it's preferenced on the idea that Canada is built on colonial foundation, where white Christian, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied men of European ancestry are given and afforded the most power and privilege. And so all of our values have stemmed from, again, this group's values, and again, this group having this unearned privilege. So what she's trying to highlight, and she's highlighting a few things, and there's lots of things that you can sort of delve into. But again, for today, what I'd like you to notice is that, through this image, she's highlighting that the red section in the middle is really, again, where we find this invisible culture that we're all swimming in, that highlights the norms. So again, if you look at the very center in the red here, the norms are identities and characteristics that are valued. So again, in any given space, society, our benchmark is related to, again, if you look at, you can just kind of quickly scan white, male, cisgendered, upper class. I didn't mention before, having being a homeowner, being mentally robust and mentally healthy is also the assumed norm in our society. And then if you start to move out, the document highlights and I think really illustrates, again, other areas of identities and how they move away from that center of power and privilege. So again, you can start by looking at sort of the darker green then the lighter green areas to see other identities that, again, I'm sure, we are all multi-identity people. I'm sure, again, you can, you can relate to some of those outer areas, and or, again, you can see the trend in terms of equity deserving groups, diverse populations, Black, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, likely on the very edges and on the margins of the circles. And then she has highlighted sort of the isms and the structures that are, again, creating the barriers, right? And those are on the outside. So we have racism, we have ableism, we have education discrimination based on religion on the outside. So maybe what we'll do is let's again take a little bit of a reflection point here. And either using your agenda, so what you can do, and I've kind of modeled this, I'm not sure if you can see it there, but if you want, you can take your agenda if you don't have this written out, and you can, use the screen, but just plot and identify where your power and privilege resides. There are places and spaces where it might be closer to the center. There's other places and spaces where it might be a little further. So I'll give you a minute to either do, again, a visual reflection if you don't have access to a pen and paper, and or if you have printed it out or want to use the notebook, you can actually highlight. And I'm going to do the same as everyone is doing it. So thinking about yourself, where does your power and privilege reside? Okay, so I'm going to quickly share, just going to check and again, we'll see if you can see it, what my circles look like. And, I think, it's clear that, I do have areas of privilege, but it's also clear that there are places and spaces where I'm, again, further away from that center of privilege. I'm a Black woman, and I think that's the first identity that people see, and that's probably the areas where I experience the most discrimination, bias, and the barrier that every time I walk out my door, that's what I'm thinking about, because that's, again, the easiest thing for others to identify, and for others to, again, kind of use their bias against me. There are other things that people don't know about me that's not, again, visible, right? So I do not consider myself robust with having robust mental health. There is the fact that because I've lived in this culture of systemic racism, I have also internalized a lot of it. So that has impacted my mental health. And again, the fact that I'm of a darker skin. So again, there's one section, there's light skin, middle tone, and dark. So I'm definitely aware of that. So that's, another thing that I'm bringing out there. So in any case, I'm hopeful that, this has sort of demonstrated a few things. Again, a recognition of where your power and privilege lies, but also now maybe that, again, that dynamic of it's not all, we're all multidimensional people, and therefore our identities work in lockstep. They work together to impact our experiences. So maybe I'll get you to do one more quick thing. If you can think about a young person in your life, and maybe think about 2 or 3 young people, think about students, think about, it could be your own children, and maybe do that same circle, or just reflect on, again, young people, students, where their power and privilege resides, and see what differences happen there as well. So I'll give you a second to do that.
Chanel, there was an interesting comment in the chat around, what we might include in that other category.
Right, there is that other category. Yeah. And so what was said? Yeah.
Well, there was no example, but one thing that came to mind for me was even just in Denise's example, around her physical ability or her ability to perform athletically, as perhaps in this context of health and physical education, providing her with a privilege. But I think that other could likely be anything, but perhaps you want to suggest other examples there.
Yeah, no, I was going to note that again, Dr. Tan, knowing that this wasn't a perfect document, and knowing that again, our language around our identities is evolving, and our understanding around how do we want to identify is evolving. She kept that space of others, which I appreciate, and yes, in discussions like this, it often comes up what can fit in there. And so for me, that is, I love that, because it does, again, create a pause moment and a notice moment for people to really think about, either what have I been suppressing as an identity in order to fit in, or in order to stay safe. And yeah, so I've again heard different things that can be added here, again, depending on the context. So a lot of it is getting a little bit more specific about, yes, your experience related to, like the way you define and describe your health and well-being, like what's important to you there, and is there identity, a piece there to that. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Now I know you're jumping into the slides. I'll just tell you there are a few comments that we're suggesting. One other could be around body size. So I'll just put that out there as one that seems to be resonating in the chat. But you're also getting a lot of acknowledgement in here that this seems to be a really useful tool to folks.
Oh. Excellent. Good. So there's one more thing that I want to highlight that is also highlighted in this tool, and it's the idea of intersectionality. So I'm just going to take a quote from the back of the handout. So I mentioned it, but I just want to say, so intersectionality is really intersectionality is a tool and a framework that helps us to recognize the different areas of identity and how they overlap and how they are related to each other. And based on these different identities, we each have a unique experience of, again, inequities, discrimination. We each have a unique experience in terms of how we interact and relate with policies, practices, programs, and it's so important as people with power and privilege, to recognize and to build a practice of awakening and awareness about intersectionality, because it can have such amazing positive impacts when it does come time to equity-centered leadership and decision-making that is centered on inclusivity and that is centered on equity and justice. The framework and the tool and the language of intersectionality was developed by American scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. So I encourage you, if you are interested in building this muscle of looking at things from an intersectional equity justice lens, to Google her, and you'll find a lot of information there. So really, as I mentioned, a lot of this is about, remembering that we're all swimming in this culture of this invisible culture, right? Where again, white supremacy ideals are the ideals that are the norms. And how do we get out of this autopilot way of behaving and thinking? And that's the hard work, right? And that's again where on a day-to-day basis, I'm encouraging you to do three things. And so I'll go back and look at those 3 A's, but frame them a little differently. But basically, it's on a day-by-day basis. You're asking yourself, what do you see, right? What do you see? How are you interpreting it? How are you recognizing your own lived experience, background, and lenses that you wear to process that information? And that's really a big part of the disruption work. So as I mentioned, there are ways of disrupting our autopilot and the status quo. And to me, critical questions are one of those ways. I'm just going to quickly go through, the whole idea of this practice of diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice, but really focus on moving us from diversity and inclusion to equity, intersectionality, and racial justice. And by example, we do ask different questions when we're focusing in on these things. Diversity basically asks who is in the room. That's not enough. Inclusion is a lot better. It's asking, who has a seat at the table, and now is everyone's voice valued and heard? And as the Ophea's plan is centering inclusion, I totally think that's the next place for us to start. Society has been focused on diversity. It hasn't achieved the outcomes that we want. We really need to start with inclusion. And from inclusion, build your muscle to ask questions related to equity and intersectionality, which again now really gets at recognizing, again, our unique experiences and the barriers we face, and designing and reimagining new ways of doing things that, eliminate those barriers. So 2 questions there, how will our decision impact people with different identities? That's ask that question, when you're making your decisions. Ask yourself, are you considering assumptions that we might be making regarding the abilities and resources of, again, equity deserving groups? When we move to racial justice, again, you are now working at sort of the systems level pieces, and you're asking yourself, who has the power and influence around the table? How can that power be shared? What traditional frameworks and wisdoms are we applying here? I really loved the land acknowledgement, and again, the idea that many Indigenous cultures do not think and don't have a concept for land ownership, right? It's all of ours. It's collective. We're part of the land. So again, it's to me, how can we adopt, use, build relationships with, again, those different traditions? So yeah, going back to our, my 3 main messages, again, I didn't note it in terms of the 3 A's here, so I'm just giving you another way of looking at it. But, 3 key things and 3 key strategies that you can do as a ally and co-conspirator, accomplice in this work is, again, to notice, to pause and reflect, awaken your sense of awareness. Without awareness, there can be no change. Second, question for deeper understanding and inclusion. And to me, that reminds me of the imperative, know your audience, right? Let's remove assumptions. Let's build better relationships. Let's ask better questions so we can know our audience better. And the third one is the acting, right? How and where can you identify opportunities to use your power and privilege to amplify the voices of those that are historically marginalized? And again, that goes to, how can you amplify the bright spots, the assets, the skills that students, that, the diversity of students, have in the space of health and physical education. So we have an activity for you to, again, reflect on this. I know it's been lots of information shared. I'll share the activity, and maybe just before we start, if there are any questions, I haven't been checking the chat, but if there's anything you want to, if we have anything we want to touch base on before we go into the breakout rooms, I'm happy to do that. So we would like to put you in breakout rooms again, to discuss these 2 questions. So I imagine that, for many of you, you're already engaged in the disruption and interruption work that's needed to re-envision places and spaces where students feel like they fully belong. So, I would love for us to be to inspire each other. So, having reflected on power and privilege, what are you already doing to interrupt and disrupt our current culture and the current culture of systemic racism. And then, so think about your roles in classrooms and schools, within school board spaces. And let's share some of the practices you're already doing. And the second question, how can you amplify that? Or if you're not engaging as much, what can you do? What might you do to disrupt, again, those autopilot thoughts and those autopilot behaviors that, again, create harm and exclusion in the classroom? So we've created a few extra pages in the Jamboard. So we're now going to be looking at pages 5 to 8. We'll have both of these questions on the Jamboard. So feel free to, again, share in your group. And correct me if I'm wrong, it is a group, right? You're putting,
Groups of 3.
Groups of 3. Thanks so much for clarifying. Yeah. So share in your group, but also, again, to inspire others. And so that we can capture some of the ideas, we'd love you to take the time to add those to the Jamboard as well. And I really do hope that, you were able to do some co-reflection, some of your own reflection around power and privilege. There really is so many different ways that you can use this tool. There's a lot of fine print on the back. So, I encourage you to revisit it. And revisit it in your own context, either as an individual engaging in this work, or again, in your workplaces, in your community spaces. One idea that we had was, how can you, again, overlay the education or education culture and or the specifics of health and physical education and your work onto this. So what does power and privilege look like in your industry and in the sector? That could be, an exercise that takes you down, again, a path towards action as well. With that being said, I'm curious, and we have a few minutes to take some thoughts in terms of what people reflected on, what emerged for you. So we can probably hear from 1 or 2 people if anyone wants to share reflections that emerged through the conversation. Was that a hand, a not hand?
That was a hand.
It was a hand, okay.
Really quickly, and I'm going to ask Karen and Fred if they are uncomfortable, maybe to quickly go off mute. We had some really good conversations as a small group. It struck me that both of my colleagues are dealing with issues in terms of trying to rename either physical spaces like a school or team names. And just the struggle and the bureaucracy around that. It reflected, and I hope, Janice, you don't mind, but I said, like, one of the largest advocates probably in Canada, if not like Ontario, around some of these things is some of the good work that Janice has done around like renaming like trophies and just like bringing additional attention to that area. But a real struggle in terms of trying to just address those.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. That. Yeah, it's not easy work. It's complex work, but again, it starts with that awareness building piece and working through that, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I did notice the Jamboard had a few ideas, and feel free to continue to add to that. But I loved seeing the idea of active listening in there. Which I'm a big fan of as well. And the idea of finding ways day by day, moment by moment, to again, remember that we often work in our comfort zones. We work in a default way. And how can you, again, take those moments of pause and reflection, see those things, and then put them aside, and then chart a different path and do something differently.
Thanks so much, Chanel. We always really appreciate the insights that you provide. We're shifting into a slightly different portion of our agenda, where I'll perhaps draw a thread again to some of the imperatives that I was referring to earlier in our strategy. And so in the spirit of centering the margins and highlighting student voice, we truly have a privilege here today of having a student join us. And so Yumi Lee, who's sort of recently joined our screen here, was also included in some of your pre-reading package. So if you did have a chance to look at the advocacy position around quality health and physical education, you would have perhaps noticed a link to a video that Yumi created along with some other students as well. And there are more of those videos to come out in the coming weeks. So Yumi has kindly agreed to join us today to provide a little bit more color on some of her recent experiences in health and physical education and physical activity in secondary school. So we're really thrilled and privileged to have you here with us, Yumi. So thank you so much for taking the time. So Yumi, I know I could have read your bio slide, but I really wanted to lean into the opportunity to have you sort of tell us a little bit about who you are and your story. And if you want to shed some color a little bit on what happened when you were in secondary school, how you identify, how might you describe for folks who you are?
Hi guys, I'm Yumi. I'm currently a university student at York University. I'm in like the concurrent education program and I'm studying kinesiology. So hope to become a phys ed teacher sometime. So this is like pretty on brand for me. But, yeah. I love skateboarding. That's my passion. I love eating food. I love my family and my friends. In high school, I guess, if we're talking about like my experience in high school, it was I don't know, I love sports and I love like exercising and all of that. So like phys ed was always my favorite class, but it was not like, there were definitely some things that could be changed that I hope are changing now. So I guess that's pretty much it.
So when you say some things could have been better, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like what perhaps wasn't great for you?
Yeah. So I definitely had like some interesting experiences like in high school, especially like in elementary school, like kind of the same things happened, but I feel like I wasn't able to understand it as well just because I was like a lot younger. But I remember like when I first joined my school in grade 10, we had to do like, it wasn't an option. We had to do like separated sex, like phys ed. And then in like grade 11, it was just like, oh, it's actually like co-ed now. Like you didn't really ever have a choice. And I definitely had like different experiences in both of those like situations where like in the single sex one, it was more just like it was really nice. It was like nice camaraderie. Everybody supported each other, but I never really felt like people were like wanted to be as competitive as me in like sports. So it was nice in a way, but it was also like I didn't really also feel like I like belonged in that class. And then in the co-ed one, like there is so much potential for co-ed like sports and co-ed programming, but it was just like there needs to be a lot of like good coaching for that and a lot of thought put into it by both the teachers and the students. And that was unfortunately not really put into it when I was in a co-ed program. So that was definitely a little interesting. It was like one of the situations that was the most difficult for me personally was like when educators thought they were doing the right thing and trying to be like equal by like putting like me into a position with like a guy or something that like had a lot of power over me. And like I didn't know what to do. It was like I remember one time like she was like, we're doing like this team thing and like there's gonna be one team captain that's a girl and one that's a guy. And everybody like forced me to do it because I don't know why they forced me to do it. But and then she like made me go out in the hallway with this guy that was not a very nice guy. And he was just like bossing me around the entire time. He was like, you don't know anything. Like, why would you choose this person on your team? Blah, blah, blah. Like, you don't know how to play sports. And I was like, why would you do that? Like, I don't know.
Sounds like it wasn't as particularly emotionally safe environment for you.
No.
Yeah. I see my colleague Andrea was just sending me a message. Andrea, did you want to you wanted
Yeah,
to?
I wanted to jump in and just a bit of connection. I've known Yumi and their family for quite a while, and I've known Yumi since she was in elementary school. And first off, thank you for joining our platform today and sharing your voice. But I wanted you to elaborate a bit more in regards to how you were feeling emotionally in that context that you were just talking about, in that co-ed environment, and the assumptions that may have been made that have impacted how you were or were not able to build relationships in that phys ed class.
Yeah, I think like because like I was like a more competitive girl in that class, it kind of like made people think that like they could just like throw me into like whatever they wanted and I would just like feel okay about it. Like they would just be like, oh, like you can do that thing like that's really competitive that we're all too scared to do. But I was like, oh, I'm still like scared to do that. Like,
Yeah.
like
No,
all of these guys.
it's interesting as you're talking, because I admit I see you as a very athletic person. You're outgoing, you're willing to try new things. But when I hear what you're saying in regards to how others may consciously or unconsciously make these assumptions, can really affect how they treat certain students differently over others, right? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to elaborate so that people have more context in regards to the privileges in ways that one might connect with their students or not connect with their students, right? And you talking about how, okay, the intention to have a non-gendered classroom might be better, but when teachers don't intentionally take that time to create that, like what Tammy, you were saying, that emotionally safe environment, it can cause more stress and harm, exactly what you were saying, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Andrea, for jumping in with the educator lens. Yumi, if you were to, so you've described some situations and specifically with that sort of sex segregated versus co-ed environment. Were there other situations or spaces that felt particularly stressful or challenging for you? And can you tell us a little bit about why?
The first thing that would probably come to mind was when I joined like a baseball team at school. Like I've played baseball for a really long time and I was like, I want to join like a baseball team. They have a baseball team that's so cool, right? So, and I've like always like really loved baseball. So I like tried out for this team and it was like, I don't think they had ever seen a girl try out for their baseball team, like literally ever. So I think I shocked them a little, but the coach was like, I don't know, the coach was really nice. He was like, oh, you're really good. And then I like made the team. But then he didn't take enough time to like make sure that I guess like his players knew that maybe like they had to be nice to me. Like, I don't know, it takes a lot as a coach to just like make sure that like everybody is going to feel welcome. And I don't think like a lot of coaches, especially male coaches, realize that if you have like someone like a girl on an all boys team, you really need to like zone in on making sure that like all the guys on the team know that like this person is to be respected and it like it doesn't matter and you shouldn't act like you're so shocked about this. And also the fact that like if you're expecting so much of this person, like a lot of like these guys, they were like offended that I joined. And like when you feel like people are offended when you join something, it makes you perform worse, obviously. So it's like it was just overall not very good.
It sounded like the culture of the team certainly wasn't in a state of readiness for the inclusion that may have been required to participate. Yeah. Yumi, you talk about loving skateboarding. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what kind of environment perhaps you've created for yourself there? What's unique about skateboarding? Why do you feel good there?
Skateboarding is just like amazing. Like you should all try it. It's like this one girl, I went skating in Montreal recently and I met a bunch of skaters from Montreal and we were just talking about skateboarding and she was like, whenever I hear people say they don't skateboard, I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, you should skate. It'll make your life better.
Mhm.
It's like, it's so true. Like everybody, like you should try it at least once. But skateboarding is just so unique in the sense that it can be a sport to some people, it can be an art to some people, it can be a recreational activity, it can be like a way of self-expression. It's like completely different for every single person who walks into it.
Mhm.
And it's also like it can be a sport that is like not team based. So it's like
Mhm.
you're only competing against yourself.
Mm.
And what I also love about it is you're recognized in the sport for like just doing your best.
Mhm.
So if you're at a skate park and you're trying to do a trick, even if it's like just literally like riding up and down a ramp or something, people will like recognize you for like being out there and like trying,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is really awesome.
Mm.
Yumi, I know you started a bit of a business in connection with skateboarding. And so what type of environment do you try to create there so that folks feel as though they belong? Can you tell me how you do that?
Yeah, me and my dad started York skateboarding because when I started skateboarding, there wasn't like anybody, any girls, anyone at our local park. And there wasn't ever a safe space for like kids, especially kids of like diverse identities, to learn skateboarding.
Mhm.
So we really wanted to create that space, and we both have a lot of experience in like education and like teaching. So we were like, okay, let's do this. And we've been able to just like, I've been able to realize like the power of like when you're building something like that from scratch, like a community, how much power you have like to create an environment that's really safe and accepting.
Mhm.
And just like I don't know, like I'm the lead instructor, I'm a girl.
Mhm.
I don't know, like not a lot of kids see that. So sometimes I'm their first introduction to a girl with short hair. And now like we have like a bunch of diverse instructors that are of a lot of different identities and a lot of different ethnicities. So the kids that we teach are automatically not going to have an assumption that like one identity is better at skateboarding than the other, or
Mhm.
like vice.
Mhm.
Mhm. Thanks, Amy. I'm going to hand it over to you in a second, Robin. I just want to ask one more question. You created a unique environment for skateboarding. I think that's what you're talking about. So is that, could we imply that your experience in skateboarding hasn't always been positive? Is that fair? Like, were there moments where in more of a mainstream skateboarding culture where that was not the case for you?
There's moments like that like every day when I'm at the skate park.
Mhm.
Every day. Skateboarding is like sometimes people like get tricked into thinking it's like a super inclusive activity, but it's really not. It's really hard to get into skateboarding, and it takes a lot of courage to get out there
Mhm.
in like groups of like all these guys who are like who have been doing it for years and who
Mhm.
have dominated it for years.
Mhm.
So definitely like when I was first starting, it was very hard because like just like for anybody, like it's really hard to like make friends in the scene and find a solid group of people to skate with. It's especially really hard if you're a girl, and especially really hard if you're a girl who looks like a guy like me,
Mhm.
because people are just like they just like are full of assumptions about you, and you're constantly having to be like no, like like one of the most common ones I get like every day is because I'm really good, people assume that like I'm a guy.
Mhm.
Mm.
Thanks, Yumi.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
know.
Robin, I'm going to hand it over
Mm.
to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yumi. There are so many threads I'd love to pick up on, and we've got a few minutes left. Let me I really appreciated this last comment you made about you can be tricked into thinking something is inclusive. And you made a comment earlier about, that sometimes there's a sense that there's good coaching, but it's really not. And you need to put thought into making sure that the coaching is good. Tess, can you say a little bit more about like, what are the markers of something being inclusive? What needs to be in place?
That's a really difficult question. And it's like very, very multi-layered in my opinion, but it's just like, I don't know. I guess like if I'm gonna like go back into like my skateboarding world, I'm in this like in Toronto, we have this organization collective called Queer Skate Toronto, where it's just like, I don't know, an inclusive like space for like queer folks, and just like, I don't know, it just become like a non-traditional like skater space, I guess, for like all the queer folks, like the BIPOC folks. And it's just like, it's like a space that's been created with like people that are very educated, that know what they're doing, and know that like if bad things are happening, like we're not going to tolerate things that are happening in here that are not going to be inclusive. Like yesterday, actually, I was at a video premiere where we were all in a Vans video, so that was pretty cool. And it was a queer skate event. So usually at those events, we always get some men who are like hairy chested and like get in there and take over the whole park, and we have to kick them out. And this guy was just like trying to jump off a balcony on his board and like made everybody stop for him. And it was like so ridiculous. And then and then we had a pro skater just like yelling at him, being like, "You need to get out of here. This is ridiculous. Like this kind of stuff is not tolerated in this space."
Yeah. And it sounds like in that example, it's such a good one of like, how are you really creating space for multiple people as opposed to lots of space being taken up by fewer people? And you also just, you referenced a few other things you talked about, like, and I extrapolated from it in terms of like, what are good spaces? What is good coaching? You talked about like assumptions and really challenging assumptions. You talked about making sure everyone feels welcome. You talked about preparing others to make sure the environment is space. And you said something about, being recognized for trying, which I also thought was really interesting. So I want to maybe end with this question, which is that like, if we gave you, Yumi, a magic wand and you could kind of, use that wand to really reimagine a school or classroom environment, and you can wave it and create an environment that really fosters connection and belonging. Maybe let's end with some of your thoughts on like, what would be there? What would be in place? What would you be doing as that physical education teacher that your teachers haven't?
Yeah. Just I think in general in classrooms, I think there needs to be less like I think we need to mix it up. Like everything in school seems like it's always the same, always doing the same activities. Like even in phys ed, it's like just like sports, like the same sports over and over again. And me and my dad have actually always talked about like in our skateboarding school and stuff, we want to do like, I don't know, it would be nice to like have our skateboarding and then have like music lessons and have like places where you do art and stuff. Just like in a classroom environment, I guess, like doing like more non-traditional activities and like learning like stuff with your students. Like, I don't know, like, I don't know. I've like some teachers, like they'll like bring their guitar to school and they'll like play a song and they'll have their students learn the song. And I think that's so great. Just like creating like an environment where like kids and teachers are like doing that kind of stuff together. I think that's just like something I definitely want to do when I'm a teacher.
I love that. Yumi. And I love the like sort of the implication in that is that it doesn't always have to be like this dynamic of like, I have to teach and you have to learn, and that I have knowledge to impart and you have knowledge to get from me. There's a real kind of piece, I think you're painting a picture of just a much more kind of collaborative kind of environment. And the example with music and art in phys ed, like this interdisciplinary way of learning. So thank you for that. Thank you for sparking those ideas. And I saw your video too and was so inspired by, what you talked about in terms of the gender neutral washrooms and what you talked about in terms of really rethinking co-ed. So grateful for all that you've brought to this conversation. And we want to use it as a jumping off point to take a few minutes for others to reflect a little bit on what they've heard from you. So thank you, Yumi. I'm going to get you to put up on the screen or if Tammy or Shayna could put up on the screen a couple of questions, and we're heading into lunch. So would love people to reflect on these two things here. So we'd love you to think, and this is I think a moment to take out those journals again, or if you go back to the Jamboard, feel free to add your thoughts there. It starts at Jamboard 9. And the questions really, we'd love you to contemplate are what struck you as you were listening. Lots of things were coming out in the chat, so thank you for that. What would it look like to connect more deeply with students like Yumi, to understand their individual lived experience and context? And like practically, what would that look like in practice to know your audience? What are examples of activities where gender or sex is not a factor in organizing? Yumi's raised some where that just gets in the way. And what support would you be looking for Ophea to offer? Where would you be looking for Ophea to influence? You're not going to have enough time in the next few minutes to probably answer all of those, but pick the one that jumps out at you and take a few minutes and reflect. And why don't we come back at sort of 3 or 4 minutes past the hour?
I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the commentary in the chat, because there's some really powerful discussion and some ideas in here. And so I really want to appreciate Janice's comment around providing students with the opportunity to organize their own activities and having them analyze the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So who may or may not be able to play and what effect that can have. There's just folks are really hearing you, Yumi. So I think, your voice is really powerful, and we're really, really grateful. And we know this also puts you in a bit of a position of vulnerability. And so we appreciate you bringing yourself to this conversation. It's really, really meaningful. And you are the future. You will be the educator and co-learner very soon. And so we're so excited for that. So thank you.
Thank you. This year, we had 3 amazing award winners. We're going to take some time to hear in video format from Karen Trotter, our Award of Distinction winner, from Andrea Barrow, our Award of Outstanding Contribution Award winner, and from Rebecca, our Outstanding Contribution Award winner. Originally, we had looked forward to sharing these videos, plus sort of a bit of a montage of great tributes from some awards nominees, those people who had nominated the award winners, as well as a couple of colleagues and some personal tributes as well. We had more award winner tribute video clips than we had anticipated. We had also ran into a bit of an issue where those tributes were a little bit longer than we had anticipated. And so, like, in conjunction with those two things, more and longer, we really struggled around how to best spend time. So what we're going to do is this. We are going to today to play a portion of the award winner videos. Next week, we will upload the full award winner videos to Ophea.net. We're also going to share clips through our social media. We've received some really special contributions from a number of people, some of which are on the video call today. Those will be part of the full video. I do want to say thank you again, both to the people who contributed, as well as to the award winners. And maybe I'll just take a second and then turn it back over to our internal team, and we'll start the video. But if I can just recenter again on the fact that we have 3 amazing award winners who do really, really impactful work across the province and nationally as well. It's really important that we take a moment to just sort of acknowledge what they have brought forward. So before we get into the videos, I will just one more time just say thank you so much for everything that these individuals bring to their organization, and let's watch this video tribute. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Comme Chris a mentionné, c'est tellement spécial de pouvoir reconnaître les récipiendaires aujourd'hui, puis en particulier notre récipiendaire du prix de distinction d'Ophea. Karen, c'est vraiment spécial au niveau de la communauté francophone. Donc, félicitations à tous les récipiendaires. Et puis, sans plus de délai, je vais jouer la vidéo.
Ophea congratulates all the nominees and award winners for their dedication to supporting the development of inclusive, healthy school communities. Without their passion, integrity, professionalism, and a commitment to meaningful and inclusive, healthy, active living, we would not be able to make our collective vision a reality. Each award winner has made exemplary contributions to the lives of children and youth, and we thank them.
Ophea plays a unique role in the education system. For over 100 years, we have been working to support the health and well-being of children and youth in schools and communities through quality programs and services, partnerships, and advocacy. We all benefit from your collective desire, commitment, passion, and expertise to help make Ontario a better place for our children to learn and grow. So thank you to all of the award winners and congratulations.
Toutes les lauréates ont su apporter une contribution exemplaire à la vie des enfants et des jeunes grâce à leurs conseils, leur leadership et leur engagement. Leurs actions ont façonné le développement et la prestation des ressources, des programmes et des services d'Ophea et ont également contribué à l'avancement des occasions de vie saine et active pour les élèves dans nos écoles et pour l'ensemble de la collectivité ontarienne. Félicitations aux lauréats.
Teaching health and physical education has always been my dream job. My advice to my own daughters when choosing a career path was to imagine doing something every day that you love, that you're good at, and that makes you happy. For me, that meant selecting a career that allowed me to play and be active every day, to live a healthy lifestyle, and to inspire young people to do the same. Comme enfant, on m'a toujours encouragée à jouer dehors, à grimper dans les arbres et à me promener en vélo, à pratiquer des sports organisés à l'école et dans la communauté, à essayer de nouvelles choses et à prendre des risques. Mes parents, mes enseignants et mes entraîneurs m'ont exposé à une variété d'activités et d'expériences physiques dans l'eau, sur la glace et sur terre en toute saison. Ils avaient tous une façon de rendre l'activité physique tellement amusante. En tant que spécialiste en éducation physique et santé, je disais souvent à mes élèves que je me comptais chanceuse d'être celle qui leur enseignait les compétences les plus importantes qu'ils apprendraient à l'école. Apprendre comment garder son corps et son esprit en bonne santé pour être en mesure de lire, écrire et résoudre des problèmes mathématiques. Développer la confiance en soi, la résilience, l'empathie et la compassion et comprendre l'importance de se fixer des objectifs, de travailler en équipe, de persévérer et de toujours démontrer un esprit sportif pour n'en citer que quelques-unes. J'ai adoré voir chaque élève apprendre et grandir depuis son entrée à la maternelle jusqu'à l'obtention de son diplôme en 8e année. The nature of the topics addressed in the health and physical education curriculum allows us to get to know our students on a very personal level. For those of you teaching in the field, please don't take this responsibility and privilege lightly. Create an environment where every student feels safe, understood, cared for, and valued. Love them and treat them as you would hope someone would treat your child. Help them to see themselves in the curriculum by providing them with a voice and choice when it comes to planning activities. Keep it fresh, be creative, and think outside the box. Always keep learning, challenge yourself, and allow your students to feel your passion. I share with you some very wise advice from actress and comedian Amy Poehler. Find a group of people who challenge you and inspire you. Spend a lot of time with them, and it will change your life. I have been blessed to be surrounded by amazing family, friends, teachers, coaches, and colleagues who have challenged me, inspired me, and encouraged me to try harder, dig deeper, and be better. You have changed my life, and I'm forever grateful to all of you. Finally, in the words of the late, great Kobe Bryant, the most important thing is to try to inspire people so that they can be great in whatever they want to do. My hope is that I have and will continue to inspire others to live healthy, active lives so that they can be great at whatever it is they choose to do.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Barrow. I'm the Equity Inclusion Consultant for the Limestone District School Board in Kingston. Previously, I was a health and physical education and social science teacher at LaSalle Secondary. I'm currently an Ophea ambassador and a member of the safety committee. I want to say that my husband and my children shape the work I do every day. I want to ensure that my children have a safe and inclusive environment at school and model this inclusivity amongst their peers. In my current role, I have an opportunity to find ways to make health and physical education programs in our board more inclusive for all our students and to increase their sense of belonging. This happens with creating and delivering PD to provide staff with the tools and knowledge they need to achieve this. My message to the new teachers: welcome to the profession. Your learning has just begun. Continue to find ways to challenge yourself beyond the challenges you will find in the profession. Embrace every change, as for these changes will make you a stronger teacher. Take the time to know the students in front of you. Remember, you can positively enhance their sense of belonging. Share your passion for physical fitness and encourage them to make this an important commitment to their future health. To all the teachers, remember to make the commitment to find the balance in your life to maintain your own physical and mental well-being. This is not an easy job, but is such a rewarding profession. Remember to celebrate every success along the way. Thank you.
I think the most important thing to me as a health and physical education leader is the relationships we have, be it with students, our colleagues, our staff, community members, or stakeholders. The relationships that I had as a student growing up were impactful in me heading into the teaching profession, as well as ending up in my current role as instructional program lead here in Halton District School Board. I go back to my grade 9 health and phys ed teacher, Lynn Ohanian, who was also my basketball coach that kind of paved the way for me through high school. And then I look at my leadership here in Halton with Joanne Walsh and the great names that came before, Deb Corville, Susan Orchard, and famous Amos, Sue Amos. And then I look at provincial leadership in terms of the work with Ophea and OASFE, Dave Inglis, Sue McMahon, and Laura Patterson. It's all about relationships and networking. The advice I can give to someone entering into the health and physical education field right now is to build those relationships. You never know what opportunities are going to come, and the more community you have around you, the more you'll be able to expand your own learning and be able to provide that learning experience to your students.
So lovely. Thank you so much. I wanted to also recognize that all of these folks are actually with us here today. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you do for school communities across the province. And perhaps if we want to give them a little, you won't unmute yourselves, but I believe there's an applause icon. But anyways, perhaps you want to recognize these folks, or if you're in a breakout group with them, that would be so lovely. We're just about on time. And so I'm thrilled to sort of maybe 1 minute behind move us into the next agenda item, which is some time with Janice Forsyth. It is truly my great pleasure to welcome Janice. And as you noticed on the previous video, Janice is a director on Ophea's board of directors for the last 6 years and is Ophea's president-elect, actually. Janice is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia, and she is truly a recognized leader in Indigenous sport and development across Canada. I could continue to introduce Janice, but I actually want to give you more time with Janice because it will be so worthwhile. I can tell you on a personal note, Janice, being able to collaborate with you on this particular event today and on this piece of work has been one of the most profound professional development opportunities of my career. So I'm really, truly grateful to you, and I'm hopeful and that others will feel the same today. So Janice, I'm going to stop sharing here and hand it over to you.
Thank you, and actually thank Ophea, and I thank everybody here just for taking the time, but especially thank Ophea for asking me to be on the board and for working with me. Most of my work is theoretical, some of it is practical with the work that I do with the Aboriginal Sports Circle and with governments, but being able to talk to people who are on the front lines every day in the education system is a real challenge for me, in the sense of me trying to understand how to take what I have learned theoretically and apply it every day. So this is always a valuable learning experience for me. What I'd like to do though is I've got a screen down below because I'm a horrible presenter on the fly. I always have notes in front of me, so I've got one screen below. What I'd like to do is continue with our focus on power and privilege in physical education so that we can better see how physical education as a form of embodied knowledge expressed through skills and habits has shaped relations between people. And in this case today, between Indigenous people and settlers in Canada. But I think what you can hear from the way in which people are talking, it's shaped relations between many different groups of people, depending on people's identity positions in the moment. So my intent here is to get us thinking about physical education as much more than a form of instruction in how to be healthy, and instead to see it as a way youth are socialized into a particular culture that has deep meaning and consequence, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. We generally speak about physical education as indispensable for human growth and development and for community well-being, but physical education is tied to the types of values, beliefs, and practices that reinforced white settler culture in Canada, including their beliefs about how their way of living was the most logical and civilized way of living, thus legitimizing their feelings about settling in Canada. So if we don't stop to consider the power relations that are embedded in PE, then we run the real risk of reproducing them, along with the problems they have caused, not the least of which are the long-standing health and education disparities that Indigenous people now face. So it's important for us, including myself, to constantly develop our cultural intelligence, just what I call cultural intelligence, about physical education, so that we're more able to see and understand those relations with a view to addressing them through policy and practice. There's 5 things that I'd like to work on today. One is talking about physical education as a type of socialization, just so we can get our head out of the space of practicality and take some of the work that we were doing earlier and think about it in a more systematic way and to expose it in a way that helps us make sense of all of the different things that we were talking about. I also want to offer 2 concepts that may help us think through these issues. One is called embodied knowledge. Some of you may already be familiar with it, and also white stream culture. And then I want to walk through a bit of history, because context is always important for understanding the moment that we live in. And in this particular case, when we talk about the history of physical education and Indigenous people, one of the main lenses that we can look at it through is through state-sponsored assimilation. And there are a number of markers throughout that history that show that pattern. One is education and schooling, the other is home on the land, another is religious conversion, and then schooling bodies. And then I'm going to offer some takeaway points. And they're my takeaway points that I offer you, and you may have your own, and I am always open to receiving your feedback, because I'm very interested to know what you know and how you feel about things. So I want to start with physical education as socialization. And it begins with the idea that every culture in the world values moving bodies, but places different values on those bodies. What one culture might think is beautiful and appealing, and thus should be revered and supported, another might think is deviant and immoral, and should be controlled and discouraged. It could also be what one culture might think is useful, another thinks is unproductive, and we can spin it any number of ways. So what people value stems from their culture, meaning their attitudes and beliefs towards socially constructed ideas about a whole host of things related to the body, like its value for work and education, the distinction between leisure and work, ideas about sex and gender, ideas about race and class, and so on. In other words, all of the intersecting factors that affect the power and privilege diagram that we saw earlier. And in my view, I thought the other category was actually really interesting, because some of the most meaningful analyses always come with the ones that we can't quite label yet, or we can't quite figure out the invisible, if you will, or the hidden curriculum. So physical education is a specific type of socialization achieved through movement. It differs from other movement culture because it's usually sanctioned by the state. and taught in formal institutions like schools, where the rules for engagement are codified to ensure it's done right, which means PE is embedded in a larger cultural framework of schooling and the politics embedded in each school system. So consider the images you see in front of you, and I hope you can see them clearly enough. Just take a look at them for a minute. There's 4 of them on the screen. Now think, what is the first word or first thought that comes to mind? For instance, what image do you find most beautiful and why? What image turns you off and why? Is there one that startles you? And then ask yourself why. Or is there one that you immediately associate with health? And ask yourself why that might be so. Or, since we're talking to a specific sector, one that you consider proper physical education, and why? Each response speaks volumes about our attitudes and beliefs towards movement culture, and in this case, physical education. What we make bodies do and what we don't allow them to do under specific conditions is always an expression of broader culture. It's an expression of what we think is appropriate body behavior, of what is safe, of what is beautiful, it is what is healthy and productive. And those ideas are tied to ideological patterns about sex and gender, race and ethnicity, able-bodiedness, the way bodies look, nationhood, industry, competition, commercialism, you name it, the list goes on. And so this means that movement is always political. There is always consequence and meaning that stems from doing things one way and not another. So children and youth have always learned about themselves and the world around them through physical movement. We were asked earlier to explain why Ophea and the work that Ophea does is so important to each of us individually. That's an expression of what we have learned. Yumi's talk is an expression of what she has learned. So the way they experience life and culture through their bodies is central to who they think they are and to who they become as adults. It forms the basis for their lifestyles, their identities, their values, their beliefs and practices, and of course, their sense of belonging. And it's this infinite connection between the mind and what might some call the spirit and the body that is the essence of what it means to be human. What we make our bodies do and don't do expresses who we are as individuals and as a society. It's another language, another way of communicating with each other without having to say a word. So there are many reasons why we should appreciate what embodied knowledge means for us in our daily lives and the lives of the young people we interact with, because it's a highly visible form of communication that has very real effects. So we can say then that embodied knowledge is an accumulated way of knowing that is deeply rooted in the body. And today I want to focus on how embodiment gives physical form to values, beliefs, and practices that make up broader society, and what this means for relations between people, specifically Indigenous people and settlers. Doing this kind of analysis is useful because it shows us how socially constructed ideas shape the way we understand and express ourselves through our bodies, how those ideas influence our approach to moving them, and the meanings we assign to those movements. And last but not least, the consequences of our embodied knowledge. And the effects are very real in that embodiment shapes who we are. And this affects the quality of our family and community ties, as well as our friendships, our ability to engage in broader social life, including work and play, our health and well-being, and so on. In 1997, a scholar by the name of Claude Denis from Ottawa U used the term white stream to describe a clash of cultural values. Now, he wrote a book called We Are Not You, First Nations and Canadian Modernity, and it focuses on, or it starts off with a 1992 court case, and so I'm taking us out of the realm of physical education, but you'll see the parallel in a minute. So it focuses on a 1992 court case where this guy by the name of Joseph Peters sued his fellow Coast Salish members who, at his wife's instigation, forced him to undergo traditional ceremonies in order to resolve various marital conflicts. So Denis coined the term white stream to refer to the underlying tensions raised through the court case, where one form of justice, that of the Coast Salish, differed significantly from the other, that of white mainstream justice. Now, this tension led to a much larger discussion about recognizing Indigenous rights to sovereignty in Canada, their right to decide who they are as a people with their own justice system. Now, the term white stream was really important. A lot of people have used it, not a lot, but many people have used it since then in their own context. And it conveys the idea that while society is not white in socio-demographic terms, meaning we don't see mostly a sea of white faces throughout the country, it is principally structured on the basis of white European heritage, with the result that our dominant institutions like the justice system are structured to serve dominant white interests. So in the context of physical education, it means that physical education has been primarily shaped by individuals of white European heritage in ways that privilege their traditions, their practices, their meanings, and their structures. And we know this is also structured along lines of sex and gender, ability, and so on, our power and privilege diagram. So my point is, white stream is an example of systemic racism, since the structure of the system, if followed, will always produce outcomes that discriminate against those who are not white. It's not to say that the hegemony of whiteness or white stream is complete. There are plenty of examples, or what we might call cracks, in the white stream system. So for instance, opportunities for sport created by and for racial and ethnic groups outside of white stream society also have a long history in Canada. Power has never been one-sided. The history of power and privilege is that there always is a history of resistance. Consider, for instance, the North American Indigenous Games. It was established in 1990. It's a major multi-sport and cultural festival for Indigenous youth in Canada and the United States. The organizers of these events, by exercising their power to shape the sporting opportunities they preferred, challenged the perception that the white stream system was the sole legitimate opportunity for sport in Canada. And these types of challenges are necessary because people need to imagine the possibility for social change before it can happen. And these alternative possibilities outside the white stream sport system meant minority athletes didn't have to remain excluded from sport. They also didn't have to participate within the white stream sport structures that did not contribute to positive experiences for them, such as having to endure racism directed at them or navigate a system that structurally made it hard for them to participate. So for example, when racialized athletes were banned from white stream sports, they often countered with the creation of their own leagues and competitions, limited to participants from a specific racialized background. The NAIG is an example. And this provided organizers with the opportunity to assign their own meanings to sport and to develop their own traditions in keeping with their own cultural understandings. And it created opportunities for marginalized group members to play sports when they did not have that chance in the mainstream sports system. So let's take a brief look at the cumulative effect of cultural assimilation through sport and physical education, and then apply our understanding of embodied knowledge and white stream through this process, where PE has been, physical education has been an important facet of Indigenous assimilation in Canada. Some of you might be familiar with Shinguak's Vision. It was a book that was published in 1996 by J.R. Miller. And he's a historian he's the historian who wrote that book. And that book actually is the culmination of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and it actually fed into the TRC. So he's a fairly prominent historian behind the whole history of the residential school movement understanding in Canada. What I really like about his work is that he makes a distinction, not necessarily overtly, but through his writing, between education and schooling. So he makes a distinction between education and schooling, where oftentimes those two terms are used interchangeably as if they were the same thing, but they are not. They're two vastly different ways of socializing children into a broader culture. So whereas education is a process that all cultures of the world engage in, not all cultures use schooling, which is a very specific institution. Not all cultures use schooling to educate their young. So in a way, the distinction is similar to the problem Claude Denis explored through his 1992 court case analysis about the two forms of justice being at odds with each other, the Coast Salish way and the white European way. Consider this for a minute. Here's a very simple exercise to get us thinking about the difference between education and schooling. Just imagine we're 100 years or so into the past, and you and your family depended on the land for survival. And I don't mean going out in the back and farming. This is 100 years ago. What physical skills and competencies would you need to get by? This is before stores. This is before electricity, before running water. Now, what physical skills and competencies would you need to get your food, to build your shelter, to make your clothing, to fend off attack, because those would be your necessities for life. So take a few minutes, just take a few minutes to think about it. Create a little list, aim for 3 things. What competencies would you need to get by? What would you need to get your food, build your shelter, make your clothing, and fend off attack? Okay. So prior to European settlement in Canada, Indigenous people lived off the land. And to do so, they needed to be fit. So they constantly trained using their own sports and games to prepare them for survival. For instance, they needed, and let's see how many of these you got, endurance, right? For running short and long distances, for instance, chasing game or protection. They needed strength for carrying and hauling items, for carrying your food, for building your shelter, for warfare. They needed power, which is strength plus speed. And this is for taking down game, for protection, for building. Accuracy. They worked a lot on accuracy for hunting and for warfare. Balance, right? For traveling over uneven terrain. We are so very lucky, if you will, where most of the places that we travel on have been traveled on or paved over. It wasn't the same 100 years ago. They also needed pain tolerance. That was a highly valued skill that they taught each other. And this was needed to keep on with survival. If you broke your leg or your arm or you were sick, you had to keep on in order to survive. So the games and contests they engaged in were more than fun pastimes. They built the competencies they needed for their land-based lifestyles. These games and contests were therefore required training for life on the land. But equally important, their games and contests also reinforced their connection to the land because the land was their home. Home meant traveling on the land, and it wasn't limited to one definitive spot. Now, we heard the elder speak about the land acknowledgement earlier and talking about how the Indigenous people were the stewards of the land and how they were nomads. And I think it's important to point out that this is not to confuse traveling on the land with just traveling aimlessly without direction. They all had clear ties to different parts of the land, which meant they had a rich and detailed understanding of their traditional territories. They knew exactly where they were going based on knowledge handed down through generations, through experience. That's why when the Europeans landed here, they depended on them for survival because Indigenous people knew how to get from one place to the next without calamity. They knew which parts of the land and water to traverse and when, and which parts to avoid, where to get game or fish, edible berries and shrubs, and good material for shelter. They knew how to read the land that they were on because the land was their home that they traveled on. And this changed beginning in the 1800s, where European settlers began to impose their own definitions of appropriate physical behavior onto Indigenous people. They used policies and legislation to enforce their views. And so we begin to see the early start of the White Stream system, of the institutionalization of it. And these changes had profound effects on Indigenous lives. Just consider for a minute the favorite Canadian pastime of fishing. In the mid-1800s, Canadian anglers lobbied to have their own ideas about appropriate sport fishing enshrined into law. They did this to curtail Indigenous rights to fish and hunt for subsistence, claiming that Indigenous ways of fishing using spears and gill nets were uncivilized and harmed the environment. And so laws were subsequently passed throughout Canada that supported their views. What the anglers had failed to realize, or at least acknowledge, was that Indigenous fishing methods were highly efficient because spearing was more effective than angling as a means of selecting fish by size and class. But it was the Canadian sportsmen's views, the angler's definition of appropriate sporting behavior, that became enshrined in law and remains an obstacle to Indigenous fishing practices to this day. So then what we begin to see through the 1800s and the early 1900s is how Indigenous connections to their land and water was undercut by the nation state. The move to gain control over Indigenous economic subsistence activities through redefinitions of physical behavior was soon followed by prohibitions against traditional religious ceremonies. Church and state officials expressed frustration at what they saw as the lack of spiritual and economic progress among Indigenous people. And they attributed the problem not to their own cultural biases or to the impoverished environments that Indigenous people had been forced into, but to Indigenous people's ongoing participation in their so-called backward customs. They characterized Indigenous ceremonies such as the potlatch and the sundance, which could be extremely physically demanding, as deviant and immoral, especially in cases where body piercing was part of the protocol, saying that they left the people poor and were counterproductive to Christian conversion. Many Indigenous people were communally oriented, and they had to be in order to survive. Therefore, many of their ceremonies revolved around the redistribution of goods and involved the destruction of property as a form of cultural expression that confirmed and maintained social and family relations. But it's not hard to see how these practices challenged European notions of ownership and thrift, the accumulation of goods, right, for self-advancement that lay at the heart of the growing capitalist economy in Canada. And these practices also challenged European senses of propriety, especially where the body was concerned. And so we have growing ideas that are being institutionalized and enshrined in policy and legislation in Canada that reinforce the white stream or white settler ways of knowing. And then we have a number of changes that happen at about the same time, many of which you might know through the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the formal establishment of the Indian residential school system in the late 1800s further undercut Indigenous forms of education and Indigenous ties to land and reinforced settler ideas about what proper education looks like. And there you see a quick history of that process. With 1867, we have Confederation. In 1880, we have the first national policy on Indian education. And then the residential schools last for about 100 years, with the last federally funded school closing in the 1990s. And in both the residential and the day schools, and there still has not been a significant audit done on the day schools, but they were set up with the same objectives. The people involved in each school system enacted their own ideas about what was appropriate physical behavior for boys and girls, about what was healthy, about what proper bodily comportment looked like, about the appropriate separation between work and leisure, about instilling deference to authority, about instilling what we call sporting nationalism, meaning what sports signify Canadianness in Canada, and a whole range of other deep meanings that were integral to the program of assimilation. And we have generally two broad phases that characterize the federal government's approach to Indigenous health and bodies and physical education. And we can differentiate them between the changes in the changes to the 1951 Indian Act. And there you can see before 1951, the federal government was mostly concerned about disease. And so they implemented physical education for health reasons. And after 1951, the focus was mostly on assimilation, because that's when they started to wind down the residential schools. And here I've pulled out a couple of quotes from a colleague in New Zealand who's working in Australia. His name is Brendan Hakawitu. And it's a modern day expression of the colonial legacies that scholars and students are dealing with. And it's important to hear from scholars like Brendan who are writing about their experiences, because they give different words for talking about what they've experienced, about how physical culture has always been wrapped up in efforts to conquer new lands, and how they themselves are dealing with this legacy literally through their body. And so you can see where he talks about ambivalence as the overwhelming feeling that haunts my relationship with my physicality, not only my body, but the bodies of an imagined multitude of Indigenous peoples, dissected and made whole again via the violent synthesis of the colonial project. He goes on to say, the history of colonial dispossession was not clear to any of us except in our bodies. Freedom was an embodied experience on a rugby field that, earlier, had been part of a parcel of lands dispossessed by colonial injustice. And then he does an about face because he's trying to unpack that, and he goes, of course, under the watchful gaze of the colonizer, controlling, manipulating, morphing with the definitive purpose of social cohesion. Part of becoming an Indigenous was becoming human in the eyes of the colonizer. So he's really troubling this positive experience that he had through rugby. So in the end, he came to distrust my own physicality, realizing how it had been used against us. It provided those roles in which the Maori were acceptable, in war exploits, in physical labor, physical education, sport, in the laundry, on the farm, in the kitchen, at the end of a shovel. Therefore, it wasn't mere abstract discourse. These lives, the reality of discourse, was the production of bodies. So I want to leave you with a few takeaway points. One is that it's important to recognize PE as embodied knowledge that is derived from and reinforces white stream values, beliefs, and practices. And doing this should allow for more creative approaches to PE, and engaging in conversations like today is part of that process. Two, learn about settler colonial culture more broadly, not just about PE. This will help unsettle taken for granted beliefs and practices that are part of that culture. Much of it can be applied to PE because it is an interrelated system. If you go back to the power privilege diagram, it's not just about PE. All of our lives float together in that sort of way. And then three, challenge yourself with questions that recast the role of PE in society. For instance, can it be a site where students learn to challenge the white stream system? And if so, how do we do that? And I'm going to end there, Tammy. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice. You've left us with so many points to ponder and so many reflections. I appreciate the integration of the discourse of white stream, because I think that was one that I recently learned about through you. So thank you for that. And I wanted to just draw attention to the imagery that you used for schooling in relation to the schooling bodies slide. It was such a powerful image. So thank you for that. Oh. So I suppose folks are perhaps pondering some of the questions that you've posed, and just to make it a bit more complex, we're going to throw another one at you. And we're going to break you up into some small groups for some reflection. But I guess I would encourage you, like, if the question or the provocation that we're posing speaks to you, feel free to discuss it. If some of the questions Janice posed, and if you've been reflecting on those and you'd like to bring those to your small group, I would invite you to do that as well. I think, the extent to which you might guide some of your own learning and reflections here would be really useful. So we're going to go back to breakout groups of 3, I believe, for this reflection. And so we tried to pose here a question for you that was perhaps a bit broader and connected to the theme of Janice's discussion. So here we're saying, discuss how you might approach disrupting white settler culture within the context of health and physical education to make physical education more meaningful and to create a stronger sense of belonging or inclusive of other lived experiences. If this question speaks to you, please go for it. If some of Janet's reflections resonate with you more, please go ahead and discuss those as well.
All right, so as people are coming, we're going to take the next 20 minutes or so to reflect on this question a little bit more, this question of how do you make PE more meaningful to create a stronger sense of belonging? And in doing so, how do you disrupt white settler culture within the context of health and physical education? We've got Janice here, so we can also use it as a chance for people to ask further questions, probe more deeply on anything you heard in Janice's presentation. And if there's anything we want to go back to and spend some more time on, we certainly can. But let me just open it up to the group. We can see there's a handful of Jamboard Post-its that started to get put up there. Who wants to jump in with a reflection on this question?
So we talked about a couple of different things. I think one was just as related to sport, not often getting very much context about where it came from. Like I would say I learned hundreds of times that basketball is a Canadian sport, but really nothing about others. And I think paired with that, like the athletes or the figures that I would have known or we would have known were none of which were Indigenous. There weren't really reading materials, books, or things kind of made available when I was younger. Like it was sort of very typical grade over grade in terms of like what we would learn about and whether we'd be given context or not. It just sort of depended as well. So I think just that being part of it, I think we talked about different parts of health and physical education. So there's the physical education, there's also pieces around healthy eating, around mental health, around living skills, like a lot of components where you can bring in really good information. So physical activity being one component of that, but there's a lot of other things we could learn about. And we also just chatted a little bit about the piece Janice was talking about around just reflect on your own competencies and what that would mean to you. And so personally for me, like in terms of like learning about being outdoor education or learning in the outdoors, I would say kind of being given it in a way and through school, through things like programming and things like that. I never really had to struggle or have an appreciation of what that meant in a different time period. It was, I'm gonna teach you how to put up a tent, but it's a tent that you just pull 3 strings and it's set up. Or, we're gonna build a fire, but here's a flint build. Like there wasn't really a lot of like teaching about the context of what this would have been like for others, for Indigenous populations, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, like what this actually looks like in a real situation. And I think probably if I'd been made to build a bit more resilience, I would probably have felt much more confident when Janice posed that question instead of being like, I don't know what I would do, because I probably, my perspective of it is, very different than what it probably could have been. So
yeah,
pieces like that, just lots of good learning opportunities, but probably just gaps generally from our experiences. And also the idea that like learning about foods of different cultures, like it also can be extended to staff as well. So not just activities done with students and giving students chances to look into their background, share their backgrounds, but also doing that with staff as well. So there's an appreciation of just everyone's background and what they can bring and opportunities to just share a little bit more.
Yeah, great. Okay, lots there. And a few groups I saw noticed on the board had this kind of question about like context of where sports have come from. And so it would be good to also hear some reflections from others too on, what would that enable by having greater context of where sports have come from, like to what end? And Janice touched on that a little bit, but would be interested to hear some thoughts. So we had Robin first and then Sabrina, I think.
We talked a little bit about too, like, it can feel very heavy and kind of uncomfortable at times, I think. And so oftentimes it feels easier to avoid it and sort of sitting with it. But I think that process of learning to sit with the challenging and difficult way it makes you feel, to have those conversations, is actually a really important part of the process. And sort of bringing, like we were talking about earlier, like, be vulnerable enough to try something new with your students, like be vulnerable enough again to sort of have those conversations and say, like, I'm learning as I go, and I'm going to get, I'm going to get better as we do this. And as we have these conversations and saying like I've heard that it's not my fault. I wasn't even around when these things were happening, or like, it's not like I did that. And you're like, okay, but you have benefited from the power structures that those systems created. And until you can sort of confront that and own that and say, like, I get privileges based on whatever your privilege is, right? And unpack that a little bit and learn to own that and say like, and it feels uncomfortable, and that's okay. Like learning to sit with it, and so you can move past it to do something about it.
Wow. Thank you, Robin. Janice is right. I see you writing stuff down. Did you want to say anything in response to that or Drew's comment?
Yeah, I mean, again, these conversations are always really helpful for me too. And sometimes I hear them in the classroom and sometimes I don't. And it's funny because, when people talk about how, they're not responsible for the past. I mean, I think we can all agree that the past is always with us in the present, right? I mean, we are a product of, yesterday and what came before. And so in a way, we are responsible for every day that we live. And I think what we're trying to do, just like, what we have done quite well with, and, and are still talking a lot about our gender and sexual identity. And we're doing really well with that, right? Whereas like 20 years ago, yeah, we wouldn't have been talking about that so much. And those would have been the same sort of, kind of things that would have been said about feeling uncomfortable talking about that sort of stuff in the gym, maybe using a little bit of different language. So it's really, just about constantly reflecting on movement culture, because again, it is not value neutral. If you think about even just the way you were taught to sit, as maybe a little boy or a little girl. And, girls sit with your legs crossed, prim and proper, don't take up much space, back straight, and boys, were given a little bit more latitude in terms of how they could sit. And so just that is a gendered way of moving the body that we learn, that becomes normalized and then becomes silent. And we only know it doesn't work for us when we rub up against it, right? When it's like, oh, John, why do I have to sit that way? So, so it's funny because I do hear that a lot about, well, that's in the past. And I'm like, well, no, actually the past is with us every single day. And that's how I respond to people when I do hear that, either in like with my work with government or work with nonprofits or even in the classroom. Although I teach history, so I don't hear that a lot from my students.
They get it.
They learn historical methods, so it is a bit different.
Yeah, I really love that line about the movement culture is not values neutral. There's a lot of power in that. You've got a lineup now, Janice. So let's we'll hear from some more people and then please chime in. So I've got Sabrina, then Jen, then Royan, then Frank.
I just wanted to share, Drew shared some of our reflections from our group and we had a lot of great discussion just about, and I think in general, what I've heard throughout the day is how our past experiences have really shaped our understanding today and thinking about, Janice, the images that you shared about like what we consider beautiful with respect to different ways of moving the body, I think is so important. And from my knowledge and growing understanding of the curriculum, like other things like healthy living skills and social emotional learning, like where do these, I think for me, just reflecting and asking why, like where did I get this knowledge and what do I, think is the concept of health and wellness, right? When we teach students about like healthy and active living throughout a lifetime, like what does that mean and where did these views and beliefs stem from? And understanding, I think you made a great point about like the mind body, how is this understood within different cultures? Because I think all these can be tied back to the curriculum, but we just want to ensure that we're embracing different ways of knowing and understanding these important relationships that we're trying to encourage and foster in students from early on. So yeah, just trying to be critical and reflective, I think, throughout our work.
And that's a great example. And oftentimes in my class, again, I teach a lot of history. I give my students the example of hygiene, health and hygiene. And so when the Europeans came and settled and they thought, living on the land the way the indigenous people did was not only nomadic, but it was unhealthy. And they wanted them to live in a settled kind of community and have like a shelter that looked like a house. And that's when a lot of the diseases started because people were living in close spaces and and they weren't moving from place to place where, there'd be a lot of fresh air and they weren't around their own waste, if you will. Meanwhile, in Europe, they've got like people throwing crap out the window through their buckets, landing in the streets. And if you're going down the old cobblestone streets in Europe and you see those like, the divots on the side of the road, the channels, that's where like all of that, when the rain used to come down, it was supposed to wash everything into those channels and wipe it away from the city. But like, where do you think people went to the washroom, right? They went in the bucket, dumped it out the window. And there are hilarious stories of like people who could writing about having,
walking down the street, and not supposed to be healthy, right? And so when you get Indigenous people too, looking at the past, commenting on how Europeans lived, I mean, you get some really kind of interesting kind of contradictions. So it's the same with ideas about healthy living today, right? When you get other people's perspectives on, okay, well, that works and that's a real shortcoming, and how come we don't do this? And how come this idea got marginalized? Then you could see how a particular way of living has been institutionalized. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Jen.
Yeah, so something that came up in my group when we were discussing was when we're talking about ways to disrupt white settler culture, specifically in H&P, it kind of goes back to revisiting like what we think the purpose of H&P is, and tying that into what Janice was saying about, this notion of education versus schooling, and Indigenous education really being centered on how do we as what are the skills and competencies that we as a community need to exist safely and in, right relationships with one another, whereas a lot of H&PE today can be seen as more individualized and assessed as sort of an individual skill, like a showcase of one's individual proficiency, whereas so much of what Indigenous teachings were focused on is how do we collectively improve our competencies to exist in this world.
Such a good insight. Thanks, Jen. Okay, Ryan.
A lot of what we talked about in our group really stemmed from a connection between what Janice kind of inspired in us, especially with the imagery, the juxtaposition of the different bodies and the different ways of moving, and the way that it was a provocation for us. And I think that connected with the kind of disrupting the notion of what it means to do sport or to do to be active, and for it to always be associated with a capitalist sport. I think those two connections really reminded us in our group that there are huge barriers that exist that no one person is probably equipped to tackle on their own. But if we do it as a community and we do it in a way inspired by what Janice was reminding us, that asking questions is on an ongoing basis, such as why do we consider some of these people to be athletic and some of these people not to be? Those kind of things over time compound on one another, and is probably the best way to change, because it probably wouldn't work as well for any given phys ed teacher or health teacher to walk into their classroom the next day and just declare that we're doing things a different way altogether because I saw a great TED Talk or whatever it was, right? And for instance, the example that I thought of personally first, having taught phys ed, after the imagery, the striking imagery of juxtaposing Maori with kind of traditional American sports and so on that Janice provided us with, was the number of times I've heard female identifying students inside my gym say to me that they don't think that they are sporty or athletic, and their main hobby is dancing. Like, for that kind of tells us everything we need to know about how like normative ideas of like what is considered athletic or sporty or phys ed are completely narrow. And I always thought about that. So in a practical sense, that would be those kind of opportunities if we all built each other's capacity and we're aware to that every moment was like that would be a teachable moment inside of a classroom or inside of a school. That as soon as we heard something like that, the next question to the class would be, why might people who are incredibly athletic and do dancing think that they don't have a space for inclusion in our space here?
Yeah. Oh goodness, Ryan, so much there. And I like that you said at the beginning this idea of like asking questions on an ongoing basis. And I just saw this idea in the chat about like, where do these notions come from? It feels like there's asking questions and there's also questioning. And it feels like there's a distinction there, right? And I think your provocation there is we need to be questioning, how we're doing what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and giving young people the license and opportunity to do that same kind of question. questioning. Okay, Frank and then Denise.
I just, through our conversations and throughout the whole day, I just think that phys ed in terms of the curriculum and with regards to teaching games for understanding, I think has a bigger opening, a bigger door, if you will, to allow a lot of our cultural differences to come in. And that avenue through teaching games for understanding by far, in my mind, allows for the conversations to happen. And with TG Fu, I just think that you could teach, you can almost immediately bring in those different games that would highlight, the as Janice mentioned, all of those things to survive off the land. You can bring in those games a whole lot quicker and a whole lot easier, and bring them right in and have people feel included and participate right away, because it's not that traditional sport, and you can tell the story and bring out those cultural aspects in a much different way than you would the traditional classroom. So I think that phys ed is for me anyway more of the perfect landscape to try and bridge that gap and bring it to the forefront, really, in a much more practical sense. Everybody likes to play, or we want to revisit how we play it for our young ones, but you can bring it with a purpose, and that's sort of what we were talking about.
Well, first of all, I love this imagery of a bigger door. I think there's something really powerful in that. And your comment, maybe Tammy, do you want to speak for a second to this TGFU comment you just made in the chat related to Frank's point?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, so I think Frank's trying to point to TGFU as an entry point, which is certainly possible. I just wanted to point to the comment that Joanne provided in the chat, which is, there is also a danger with TGFU if we sort of promote it or utilize it as a sort of universal model of instruction, because it does perhaps, not allow us to question what it means to be physically literate in the context of our own individual and collective lives. So I think I just want to point to that as it's absolutely an entry point that moves away from perhaps, like traditional, white Western European sporting models, but it's perhaps also still founded on that. So I think just opening up space for different pedagogical approaches, TGFU being one of them, but there are many others.
Yeah, and TGFU, teaching games for understanding, for those like me who may not have known what that acronym was. Denise.
Yes. I wanted to call Tanya out in my group because the discussion that I think as an instructional lead, her observation is that certain teachers who are doing the work and creating spaces for kids, 3 of them ended up in one school. And I think that speaks to sometimes not having that collective. And so they had to go and find themselves in a place where they could, whether it was exhale or have fun or support each other. And so providing a space like this where we're having the conversations and then seeing you're not alone. So somebody else spoke to that collective. I think it was Sabrina, in terms of we are very individual in how we see things and how we perceive things. And Royan talked to that toxic masculinity of, well, why isn't dance considered a sport? And we were just watching, in the US, they've got these marching bands and they're doing drumline. And how hard is it to hold a tuba and march and get that is a physical literacy that people take for granted. And the cheerleaders who are on scholarship, I can't do a backflip. Can you do a backflip? So the way that we value and the types of movements and that we categorize them into male, female, or whatever it may be, I think the view and the lens that was brought forth and how Indigenous folk from Janice are a part of land and work collectively, but then also taking that opportunity to see it as we're all moving and we're all intertwined and we're all figuring it out, but sometimes we feel like we're by ourselves because we're not communicating about that. So it was really nice to experience that in all of the different chats. And oh yeah, people are we're working together, but sometimes we forget to acknowledge that. So
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for that.
My head always goes to challenges. That's just kind of the area that I work in. And then I would say, what happens if we're not all working together? Like what happens if you have a fundamental clash of cultures in terms of your approach, you know, to body culture? And so, for instance, I think of land-based education and the way it's getting taken up in the education system. I read some really good critiques of it. You may know Leanne Simpson, she wrote one, and there were a number over the last couple of years about how, you know, Indigenous land-based practices education. It is sovereignty, right? It's identity. Sometimes it's wrapped to spirituality and the legends and stories that the people carry with them. And so then my question then is, okay, well, how do you, you know, how do you do that? Like in your curriculum without kind of appropriating the mechanics of the actions, which often happens, and putting it in a PE context where you've, again, just like you've divorced it from the culture of the people, right? So that people can do Indigenous land-based practices. So I think there's some, like, and this is my point about the deep meaning of culture, right? I mean, and again, PE practices are often normalized, and so they're silenced where, you know, you don't do that kind of deep dive into, or maybe you do, into what kind of values and skills are, you know, are kids actually learning, you know, how are their white identities being reproduced through those practices or challenged, right? Or, and you can spin it any number of different ways. There's all sorts of fun that you can have with it, just to get kids thinking about the body, right? And what it means to move the body in a certain way. It's like social studies of the body. So.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you very much. I think, you know, I was listening very carefully to what Janice was just saying right now, because it actually had a little bit to do with what I wanted to mention. You know, getting back to this idea of what is the purpose of us having these bodies to be able to move. You know, and so our purpose can be seen as different in many different cultures. You know, the reason why I'm doing something is related to something different. So for example, the Indigenous cultures, as they were living their lifestyle, and their way of life was built on survival. So you know, to be able to do these types of things, like to have the physical endurance to be able to walk long distances or to travel long distances, you know, we I guess in the westernized world also still have this element of endurance, and we link it with sports and athletics, but just kind of unpacking that and then just reminding ourselves that we have these physical bodies that we want to be able to almost in a sense test ourselves, right? So like our idea of sports and athletics in this world may be our form of the challenge and the test to see, are we resilient enough to be able to overcome these obstacles that other cultures may have had in their way of living, in their lifestyle. And I think it's kind of chipping away and trying to find a way to create the crack within the current framework of the way things are run, in order for these topics that we're discussing right now to find their way into our potentially new way of looking at education. Because I work with a lot of different stakeholders, as well as many of you. I have principals, you know, other colleagues who all bring their own personal life and experience into the way that they're doing things. And we all think that we're doing fantastic work, trying to break down some of these barriers, but then we ourselves, unless we have this opportunity to have a conversation in this kind of forum, we don't necessarily fully understand how we might also be continuing that cycle, you know. So the idea of, you know, the crossing your legs and sitting up straight, You know, like what if, you know, somebody was up walking around right now? Would we be distracted at that? Would we be criticizing that person? You know, like I'm the person that is constantly walking around during O Canada because I can't keep my body still for 2 seconds. And that's why I got into physical education as a teacher. And so I respect that, but then I have colleagues who don't understand that, you know, and they have a specific expectation. So I think that, yeah, trying to create this sort of crack within the current framework for us to then start that education piece, I think is so important to do it and to not give up, right?
Yeah.
So to continue just pushing and try to incorporate these different elements into our way of delivering this education toward these kids, because it is true, a lot of these kids, they don't know, they're learning from us as adults, you know, from parents, and then also educating the parents as well. We just finished going through parent-teacher interviews, right? And you know, the parents keep asking me, you know, like, we noticed that our child isn't very coordinated. You know, they can't really, you know, use a tennis racket. We really want them to be able to hit a tennis ball. And I say to them, you know, well, it's more than just, you know, being able to use a tennis racket. We have many different things that we're trying to focus on in a short period of time with your kids, in order to really fully develop their wellness, their well-being, their physical abilities.
But they come with their agenda and their kind of preconceived notions of what you should be doing with their kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now you're trying to break down the barriers with the parents, but then you're also trying to find a way in order to incorporate this style into your instruction, and to create that environment of learning that's not necessarily fully teacher focused. You want them to be able to advocate for themselves. And when I say them, I mean the students as well, and to recognize those things. So sometimes you do have to completely break down what our conceptions of physical activity are, in order to give them that space to be able to think critically.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Dan, there's so much there. And I really like this notion of like the chipping away and creating the crack, as opposed to like that being a worrying concept, that being actually of what we're trying to move towards, which goes to a little bit of Janice. It's okay if we don't all agree, because that's going to reveal something. We are going to need to wrap up this part of the conversation. And I'm following the chat, and there's so many great provocations in there that I think, like, I hope people are also reading it and taking away a lot of the questions and comments there. There's one that I'll just read out loud, from Steve, that talks about important thing to find out is, how do students interpret their place in the physical education, and what do they need, and how do we find space to allow that to happen? And I think that question is a good summary of a lot of the sort of threads and a lot of what we've talked about today, in terms of really that deepening understanding, knowing your audience, centering the margins, a lot of the imperatives that Tammy talked about earlier. I want to give you the last word, Janice. Is there anything else that you want to say before we put a pin in this particular conversation?
Two things. And oftentimes when I give this talk, a lot of people get worried about, and I know I've talked to Ophea about this, the cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. They're worried about teaching Indigenous games in the classroom because there's heightened sensitivity around cultural appropriation, and I certainly appreciate that. The flip side, of course, is that if we don't do that, we maintain the invisibility and the silence that perpetuates these unequal power relations that lead to cultural appropriation. And I do believe there is a way to teach physical activities if the context is introduced around, okay, why don't we see these activities anymore? You know, what does their invisibility mean for us, and what can we take away from learning about them and even practicing them? And so not necessarily objectifying the culture or the people, and not stealing the culture and the people, but engaging in it in order to understand, which is what we do in school, right? We do things consciously and purposefully. And I think the quotes that I pulled from a colleague in Australia, Brendan Hakawitu, who's Maori, about his ambivalence, you know, about how he loved rugby and then became very unsettled by it because of what it meant for his people, I think is a call to action for all of us as instructors, to actually do something with that. So if we think we're unsettled, the students are unsettled, and because that's what they're, you know, thinking too. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we are going to kind of move into the home stretch of this of today. We'll end right at 2:30. But a huge thank you to Janice for all of that insight and that wisdom. You're getting applause there, and I know others asked earlier about the slides. We will be sharing the slides after today, including Janice's slides for people to refer back to. So we want to just do a quick, we think, fun exercise right now, where we're gonna we'll share the screen again, and we're gonna get you to go back to your phones and or put in the code and do one more answering of a question up here. And the question is really one to reflect on around sort of your imagined future. So when you look to a future of health and physical education that emphasizes belonging, if we go back to this concept that we keep coming back to about inclusion and belonging, what would be that one word that you would say? So if you go into, what would be that one word that would characterize what you would envision? Wow, look at all those words. Okay. It's interesting how inclusion seems to stay very central no matter what other words get added, but inclusion, community, listening, acceptance, engagement. I like variety. We've had a lot of conversation today about, expanding, having a bigger door, expanding opportunities, interdisciplinary opportunities, thinking about offering young people more variety. I like that word came up: safe, choice, engagement. Thank you for that. So we're going to do one last paired discussion exercise, and then we'll turn it over to Chris and Tammy to close out the day. And so the question that we'd like you to kind of consider in this last moment, as you sort of look at that word cloud, 3 questions we'd like you to think about. I'll start from bottom to top. When you look at that word cloud, like, what does it spark? What gets you excited about looking at that constellation of words that emerged from all of you? What are you leaving with today? And as you think about what that word cloud and what that future with belonging at the center of physical education in our schools, what that looks like, what is the one thing that you would need to reach that future? So you, as an agent of change, helping to contribute to that future, what do you need to enable that? So you may or may not get to all of those questions. Again, go where you and your partner would like to go around that. We have one final Jamboard for you to put your final reflections on. So you can go back onto the Jamboard. The light blue boards right at the end have that question. We're going to put 10 minutes on the clock and bring you back at around 22 minutes past the hour, and then we will officially wrap up. Yay. Okay. Just in looking at what's on the board here, I'll just maybe pull out, and then Tammy, tag team with me if there's anything you notice. It feels like there's definitely a clustering of comments about the need for continued conversation, the need to pause and reflect and be critical, and to equip teachers with more of the tools that they need to be able to have difficult conversations. So really this whole line of like questioning, which I appreciate. There was several about changing attitudes about health and physical education, and what that's going to take, more collective action, collaborative action. But I like the post-it, the consensus that this work is important and we are a community that can initiate change. And the middle ones on the board felt like it was about being like bold and brave and vulnerable and open-minded, sort of the ways of being that are required to enable some of the change that you've talked about. Tammy, anything else you'd underline?
I love that that's where you sort of ended, because for me, it's always validating when some of the core values of your strategy emerge at the end of the session, right? And so we talked about a core value for us being in relation to that blend of bravery and humility. And so I think that's really reflected here, which is lovely, right? If our core community is sort of speaking to the need to embody that, we've definitely nailed something, which is great.
Mm-hmm. So just one last ask of you. Let's just use the chat box. And before we turn it over to Chris and Tammy to close it out, how about everyone just provide a word of reflection? What are you feeling, thinking, or what are you planning on doing? So I know not everyone got a chance to put their thoughts on the Jamboard. Give us just a word that's on your mind right now about the future for you. Yeah, lots of hope. Still have energy to swim upstream. Yay, that's what it's going to take. Inspired, excited, reflection. I love the let's do it. Motivated, embracing change, being open. A few that talk about being reflective or reflection. Fantastic. Okay. Well, keep adding them if you didn't. Efficacy, that's a good one. But just a big, huge thanks from me. I'm leaving with an incredibly full heart, knowing that you're out there doing the work that you're doing. I've got 3 kiddos in my family that are either in high school or about to be in high school, and to know that there are professionals like you helping to really structure and design the kinds of spaces that I want to know that they're learning in makes me just feel very hopeful. So thank you for the chance to be a part of this today, and over to Tammy and Chris.
And thank you, Robin. I think you have such an ease and grace when you move us through some of these conversations. So we're really privileged to have you here with us. Chris, I know you want to say a few words to sort of reflect and take us home, and then I'll wrap up the technical end of things.
Okay. So again, it was a real privilege and a pleasure to join all of you today. And to have some really good conversation. I'm really humbled by the opportunity to be able to have learned from each other today. And I appreciate the contributions and engagement. So deeply humbled and thankful. To our presenters and our facilitators, so Robin, Tammy, Chanel, Yumi, Janice, thank you. This went off really well, and it was a result of the planning and the efforts that have gone into that. I know there are a lot of technical details and other details that are managed on the back end, so I would like to thank Ophea staff for that as well. Really deeply appreciative to not only our presenters and facilitators, the people on the back end, but everyone who contributed today. So we will have a number of deeply personalized, I think, reflections from today and key learnings. I think I would maybe share some of what I've heard a little bit of Robin say as well. Like in terms of, for me, it goes back to some of what Chanel mentioned, which is like the awareness, the assessing, and the acting, and the opportunity to create the cracks and consider new ways forward. We're really excited to be able to collect your feedback on today's session. A link to the event evaluation, I think will pop up in the chat. There it is. So we look forward to hearing from you. We also look forward to continuing to connect with you over the next couple of months as we collectively implement and live into this strategy. So you will hear more from us on this. I'm really excited for the path that we've carved out. I'm really excited to be able to move forward with all of you. So thank you so much for your time. And back over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Chris. Similarly, I just wanted to express my gratitude to our facilitators today and to the team. This was such a team effort. And we were just talking offline when folks were in breakout groups around the Ophea machine and how everything happens sort of seamlessly. And there's a lot of folks who make that happen. So thank you so very much. As Chris mentioned, we really just scratched the surface today, and this is the beginning of a journey that we will continue to be on for a very long time, and it's exciting, and it's also one that we carry a great degree of responsibility in undertaking this. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Pour mes collègues francophones, merci de vous être joints à nous aujourd'hui, d'avoir participé en anglais. Ça me fait toujours plaisir de vous voir à l'écran, puis j'ai hâte de vous voir en personne, j'espère bientôt. So thank you, folks. We're going to stay online just for a little bit if you have a couple of sort of final closing questions or comments, but we are expressing such deep gratitude that you joined us today. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.